Night settles over Vatican City like a velvet curtain, soft and silent, but charged with the kind of tension that breathes beneath ancient stone. The world outside slows, the footsteps of tourists fade, and the final echo of evening prayers dissolves into the darkness. Inside the Apostolic Palace, however, lights still glow in a handful of high windows, tiny flickers against centuries of secrecy. A storm whispers on the horizon, its low grumble bouncing between the marble columns, as though the sky itself senses what lies hidden behind those walls. Deep beneath the Vatican museums, far below the well-lit corridors where priceless art hangs, a steel door waits in silence. It is unmarked, undecorated, intentionally forgettable. Yet behind it lies one of the most mythologized places on earth, the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a fortress of memory and omission. Few have seen its true depths. Even fewer understand what sleeps there. A pair of guards pass, their halberds tapping faintly. The door is opened for the nightly checks. Beyond the threshold, a cold breath escapes, as though the vault exhaled after holding something inside for too long. The air smells of dust, old parchment, and the faint metallic tang of time itself. The archives are not a single room but a labyrinth. 85 kilometers of shelves, drawers, chests, and locked chambers, each containing fragments of stories the world was never meant to hear. We drift through this maze as the narrator's voice forms like a shadow among the shelves. Here lies correspondence between kings and popes, confessions written by dying martyrs, treaties that shaped continents, and secrets powerful enough to unmake nations. But somewhere deeper, far past the catalog documents, where the temperature drops and the lighting dims, there is a different kind of silence, purposeful one. This is the restricted zone. No signs mark it. No guidebooks mention it. Access requires not only a cardinal's privilege, but a level of trust so rare it has been granted fewer than a dozen times in the last century. The shelves here are different, thicker, reinforced, sealed behind glass treated to withstand fire, flood, and even chemical decay. These are the Vatican's non-circulated artifacts, relics and documents even the Church hesitates to acknowledge. A light flickers. The camera moves closer, focusing on a single shelf in the furthest corner. 3 wooden boxes rest there, each roughly the size of a shoebox, their surfaces darkened with age. Brass plaques label them only with Roman numerals. A small leather-bound envelope lies beside them, its edges brittle. The wax seal is cracked, long broken. A faded inscription on the envelope reads, "For the Holy See alone, 1889. We follow the trembling hand of an archivist as he gently lifts the envelope. The parchment inside is fragile, almost translucent. Written in looping Italian script, the message is short but chilling. It warns that the contents of the accompanying boxes carry histories from the first cities, histories that must never enter the public imagination. It ends with a note of fear disguised as piety. Some truths bear shadows too immense for mankind. The archivist swallows hard, as if feeling the weight of centuries pressing on his ribs. He opens the first box. Inside, cushioned by dark felt, lies a collection of clay fragments etched with strange lines, wedge-shaped symbols pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago. The cuneiform characters shimmer faintly under the dim light, their angles sharp, their purpose enigmatic. They are Sumerian, among the oldest written records humanity possesses. But these are not the copies housed in museums or referenced in academic journals. These tablets are originals, untouched by modern scholarship, likely removed from Mesopotamian ruins long before archaeological ethics existed. Their surfaces depict not simple lists of goods or royal decrees. They tell stories, stories of beings who descended from the heavens in chariots of fire, who ruled the black-headed people, who taught the crafts of heaven and the laws of earth. Stories of the Anunnaki. A second box reveals tablets of a more unsettling kind. Depictions of towering figures wearing horned crowns, surrounded by humans who kneel in fear or reverence. One tablet shows a star 8-pointed, resting above a winged disc. Another tablet bears a phrase that survived translation. They walked like men but shone like the sun. The third box contains a long papyrus scroll, its ink faded but still legible. Italian scholars of the late 1800s have translated the first portion directly onto the outer wrapping. Only 3 lines remain readable now. They were not spirits. They ate, they drank, they quarreled. They ruled until the heavens divided. A distant thunderclap shivers through the underground walls. It is as if the storm overhead echoes the tension now building inside this hidden chamber. The archivist carefully rewraps the scroll and steps back, his breath shallow. What is most haunting is not simply the existence of these artifacts, but the Vatican's reaction to them. The Church has always possessed ancient texts, but this is different. These relics undermine foundations. They whisper an older creation, a different pantheon, a cosmic ancestry that does not fit neatly into Genesis. The presence of these items in the Vatican suggests something extraordinary. The Church once studied the Anunnaki narrative in secret, and perhaps feared it. Imagine the moment in 1889 when these tablets first arrived. A curator or priest must have unboxed them, felt their rough surfaces, traced the ancient symbols with trembling fingers. Perhaps he recognized immediately what they implied, that humanity's earliest stories may not have been tales of gods at all, but memories of beings who walked the earth long before modern religions shaped their theologies. Perhaps he understood that these tablets challenged everything. The camera pulls back, gliding through the silent rows of forbidden knowledge. The archivist locks the boxes away, his face pale beneath the fluorescent glow. As he turns off the lights, the camera lingers one last moment on the sealed shelves. The darkness closes in as the vault door shuts, echoing into the night. Above, in the Vatican's courtyard, the storm finally breaks. Rain pours down over the domes and statues, washing the ancient stones as lightning flashes across the sky. The narrator's voice returns, calm yet heavy with implication. For centuries, the Vatican has stood guard over faith, order, and divine narrative. But buried in its depths lies a truth older than Scripture, fragments of a world where gods were not divine, where creation was not heavenly, and where humanity may have been shaped not by the breath of a single deity but by the hands of beings whose names echo through time. The Anunnaki. The question is not why these artifacts exist here. The question is, why has the Vatican remained silent about them for over a century? Dawn breaks slowly over the ancient plains of Mesopotamia, illuminating a landscape that once carried the heartbeat of the world's first civilization. As the light spreads across the cracked earth, it reveals the ghostly outlines of vanished cities. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, names whispered like incantations by archaeologists and historians, but once spoken with reverence by the people who lived under the rule of beings they called the Anunnaki. The wind moves through the ruins as if stirring memories older than recorded history. Fallen bricks, now eroded by centuries of sun, heat, and sand, still carry faint imprints of hands that shaped them 5,000 years ago. The camera drifts across these silent foundations, settling on the remnants of a massive ziggurat, its steps long collapsed. But even in ruin, something about it feels purposeful, mathematical, almost astronomical. A monument not just to devotion but to observation, a structure built to bridge heaven and earth in ways modern scholars still struggle to understand. It is here, among the oldest human cities, that stories of the Anunnaki first took form. They were not imagined as spirits drifting above the clouds. They were described as rulers, physical, present, terrifyingly powerful. In the earliest Sumerian texts, they are depicted walking among humans, dining with them, commanding them, punishing them. These were not distant gods. These were beings with faces, tempers, rivalries, and agendas. A narrator's voice guides us deeper into this forgotten world. He explains that Anunnaki meant literally those who came from the heavens. But heaven, to the Sumerians, was not a metaphor. Their sky was not the poetic vault of modern religious imagination. For them, the heavens were a place, reachable, navigable, inhabited by beings who descended in bright storms, leaving villagers trembling as the earth shook beneath their feet. The epic tablets describe moments when the sky cracked open with roaring heat. Dust spirals formed. A brilliant object descended, enveloped in fire. The people of Sumer knelt in awe as winged craft. Yes, illustrated with what appear suspiciously like mechanical wings, landed near the riverbanks. Priests described these beings as tall, radiant, and crowned with horned helmets that could have been ceremonial or protective gear. One tablet, discovered near ancient Kish, recounts an event called the Day of Arrival. According to its translation, the ground trembled with a noise like 10,000 storms, and a shining chamber descended from the sky. When its doors opened, the people beheld beings taller than men, with eyes bright as molten metal. These beings are named Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Ninhursag, figures who became deities in later myths, but who the earliest stories portray in strangely human terms. They argued, they loved, they fought, they ruled. A Sumerian priest writes of Enki, the so-called god of wisdom, visiting workshops, examining tools, giving instructions like a master engineer. Meanwhile, Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki, issues harsh decrees on labor and obedience. The texts describe him not as a spirit of air, but as a commander overseeing a vast enterprise. A slow, rising orchestral score accompanies the camera as it shifts from the ruins to digital reconstructions. Vibrant cities bustling with traders, scribes, artisans, river barges, and priests carrying offerings. But towering above them all are the Anunnaki, depicted not as ethereal beings, but as a dominant race whose presence shaped every aspect of society. Then comes a darker overlay. Clay tablets showing punishment scenes, flood warnings, and moments of anger where the gods withdrew to the sky. These stories feel strangely modern, more like political dramas or family sagas than tales of deities. Their conflicts mirror the dynamics of human courts, the jealousy, the rivalry, the struggle for control. This human-like portrayal troubled early scholars. How could the divine be so relatable? Why did these supposedly mythical figures behave like rulers rather than spiritual archetypes? Why did their temples function like administrative hubs rather than houses of worship? The narrator explains that when these stories reached Europe in the 19th century, they shattered the previous image of early religion as simple, symbolic, and primitive. Here were records describing beings who did not fit the mold of mythology. They were too organized, too technological, too present. If these were gods, they were unlike any envisioned by later faiths. And if they were not gods, then who or what were they? The camera returns to the ruins, focusing now on the details. Carvings of winged discs hovering above kings, beings carrying what look like strange instruments, symbols that resemble star maps. Archaeologists often dismiss these interpretations as misreadings, but the imagery remains hauntingly precise. A breeze sweeps across the desert, pushing sand into the air. For a moment, the ruins seem to shimmer, as if time thins enough for a vision. An ancient city alive again, Anunnaki figures descending the steps of a ziggurat as thousands bow. Priests chant, scribes record, children hide behind their mothers' robes, peeking at the towering strangers with a mix of fear and awe. We cut to interviews with scholars, anthropologists, linguists, archaeologists, explaining that the Anunnaki were simply mythological deities, reflections of natural forces and cosmic patterns. But as they speak, the visuals tell another story. The raw tablets contradict the sanitized interpretations. They present not symbols but events, not allegory but memory. One professor pauses, admitting, "The earliest stories do not read like myths. They read like accounts." Another adds, reluctantly, "The Sumerians wrote history, not fantasy." The tension rises. The narrator tells us that this is exactly what frightened religious authorities in the past. These beings walked like men, but were treated as gods. They demanded loyalty, obedience, and offerings. They taught agriculture, astronomy, metallurgy, healing. They bestowed kingship and removed it. They punished humanity with droughts or floods when disobeyed. They lived, they left, and the most unsettling part? The Sumerians never claimed to invent these stories. They insisted they were true. They insisted they were eyewitness accounts. They insisted they remembered. Lightning flashes across the desert sky in a symbolic cut to the thunderstorm over Vatican City from the previous section, forging a bridge between ancient memory and modern secrecy. The implication forms slowly, ominously. If ancient Mesopotamia remembered beings who descended from the sky, and if those memories align with artifacts hidden carefully in the Vatican's deepest vaults, then perhaps the question is not whether the Anunnaki existed. Perhaps the question is why their presence was rewritten, why their story faded, why later religions chose to elevate them into gods, or bury them entirely. The camera pulls back from the ruins once more. As the dawn finally becomes full day, shadows shrink, the desert brightens, but the mystery only deepens, stretching from the dawn of civilization to the guarded halls of the Vatican. Humanity's oldest stories speak of divine beings who walked the earth. But maybe they were never divine. Maybe they were something else. Something far more complex, far more troubling, and far more real. The world's first gods might have been the world's first rulers. And if that is true, the foundations of every later religion begin to tremble. The year is 1843, and Europe is trembling with the fever of discovery. Railways carve lines across the continent. Steamships shrink oceans. Scholars dream of unlocking histories far older than Greece or Rome. Yet in the heart of this age of enlightenment, far from the roaring engines and smoky skies, a different kind of expedition begins, quiet, cautious, and watched, from a distance, by the Vatican. Far to the east, across deserts and ancient riverbeds, the ruins of Mesopotamia are being uncovered by European explorers. When the first mounds near the Tigris are opened, they reveal something no one expected. Thousands of clay tablets, perfectly preserved in dry earth, covered in strange wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform, a language no living person can read. A script older than the pyramids, older than the Bible, older than almost everything. The camera lingers on the moment an excavator brushes sand from a tablet, and a symbol appears. Sharp, angular, confident. A word that has not been spoken aloud for nearly 5,000 years. When these tablets are crated and shipped to Europe, they arrive not only at museums and universities, but quietly, and without fanfare, at the Vatican. A shadowed carriage arrives at a side entrance of the Apostolic Palace. No record of this delivery exists in public logs. 3 chests bound in tarred rope are escorted through a narrow corridor by Swiss guards. They are brought to a private study where 2 Vatican scholars wait, both deeply versed in ancient languages, though neither has seen this script before. When the lids open and the tablets are revealed, a silence falls over the room. It is the silence of realization, the understanding that the world may be on the edge of a historical explosion. In the decades that follow, the race to decipher cuneiform begins. Across Europe, linguists labor over tablets, comparing symbols, hunting for patterns, building dictionaries. But inside the Vatican, this work is done in secrecy. The Church has always valued ancient documents, but something about these tablets feels different. Dangerous. The scholars work by lamplight late into the night, copying symbols onto parchment, whispering translations to one another as though afraid the walls might hear. One evening, a young priest bursts into the study, a tablet in his shaking hands. He has translated a fragment from an early flood story. The room falls silent as he reads aloud. A god warns a human of an impending deluge, instructs him to build a vessel, and promises to save him. The scholars stare at each other, pale and stiff. It is the story of Noah, but older, much older. The shock inside the Vatican is immense. This is not a foreign myth vaguely resembling the Bible. This is almost the same story, the same sequence, the same divine warning, even some of the same measurements. A tablet thousands of years older than Genesis is telling the story first. Letters are written hastily. Some are addressed to cardinals, others to the Pope himself. One surviving note from a Vatican linguist reads, "These writings mirror the Holy Scriptures in ways that challenge the very chronological order of divine revelation." Another note, marked confidential, warns, "Publish nothing until we have assessed the theological implications." Meanwhile, outside the Vatican's walls, the world is changing fast. More tablets are found, more stories translated. Gilgamesh, Enki, Enlil, Ninhursag, the Anunnaki. Newspapers publish illustrations of winged beings and ancient kings. Scholars give lectures in London, Paris, Vienna. The public marvels at the idea of a civilization that predated everything they knew. Inside the Vatican, the atmosphere is not marvel, it is dread. A small committee gathers in a dim, domed chamber, lit only by candles. They discuss the implications of these texts. If the Sumerians wrote about the flood before the Israelites, what does that mean for the divine origin of Scripture? If Sumerian kingship was described as descending from heaven long before the Book of Samuel, how should the Church understand biblical monarchy? If beings called the Anunnaki crafted humans from clay, how does that align or collide with the creation of Adam? One cardinal argues that these similarities merely reflect universal truths placed by God in all cultures. Another shakes his head and whispers, "But these stories are not symbolic. They are written like eyewitness accounts." The debate grows tense. Voices rise. A scholar places a tablet on the table and translates a line that reads, "In the first days, the Lords descended from above and shaped the destinies of mankind." He explains that the Sumerians were not describing gods of air and spirit, but beings who arrived from the sky, ruled physically, and left behind kings and bloodlines. The room falls into a heavy silence. A decision is made quietly, without votes, without formal decree. The Vatican will not publicly oppose the translations, but it will speak of them sparingly, carefully, cautiously. There will be no official announcements, no press bulletins. The Church will watch, learn, wait, and, when necessary, intervene. As decades pass, more tablets emerge. Some describe creation. Others describe gods quarreling like rulers, not divine archetypes. Some detail moral laws eerily similar to the Ten Commandments, but attributed to beings who walk the earth, not a voice from a mountaintop. For every discovery that becomes public, another quietly finds its way into the Vatican's restricted shelves. Meanwhile, outside Rome, academic excitement grows into full-blown wonder. Archaeologists speak of a lost world. Museums display artifacts depicting winged beings and star symbols. For most scholars, these are myths, allegories, ancient imagination. But inside the Vatican, the translators know better. They read lines that speak plainly of crafts that flew, of lords who returned to the sky, of tools of the heavens, of melting metal with the breath of fire. They read of beings who are worshipped yet die, who rule yet bleed, who descend in blazing vessels and depart in thunder. By the end of the 19th century, the Vatican has quietly assembled one of the largest private collections of Mesopotamian texts in the world. Not to celebrate them, not to display them, but to understand what they might mean for everything the Church has built over 2 millennia. A single question lingers in the corridors of the Apostolic Palace, whispered only in private. If these ancient stories are not fantasy, if these beings truly walked among humans, if their legacy shaped the earliest civilizations, then what does that make them? And what does that mean for the origins of the faith the Vatican guards so fiercely? The answers the Church fears may lie in those tablets, and that fear will shape every choice they make in the centuries to come. The trail of clues that once seemed bright and promising begins to shift into something darker, heavier, and almost oppressive as the journey reaches the forgotten cloisters where the last whispers of the Templar legacy are said to linger. The landscape itself feels charged with tension, as if history is trying to speak through stone and wind, urging caution even as it beckons the curious deeper. There is a sense that the past has not fully died here. Instead, it lingers in fragments scattered across abandoned manuscripts, eroded carvings, and stories passed down quietly through families who have long feared what those secrets might reveal. Every step taken in this part of the search feels less like historical research and more like trespassing into a realm that was never meant for outsiders. Within these derelict spaces, long-locked rooms seem to exhale centuries of dust the moment their doors are opened, as though releasing memories too heavy to bear. Crumbling candle stubs rest in rusted holders, hinting at rituals performed by hands that believed they were safeguarding something larger than themselves. Some walls are adorned with symbols half hidden by mold, their meanings blurred by time yet still pulsing with intent. These symbols appear again and again in unexpected places, as engravings on broken tiles, as faint etchings on wooden beams, even as patterns meticulously drawn beneath layers of soot on long-abandoned chapels. They suggest an elaborate code, a language woven into architecture and art, whispering instructions to anyone who can read between the lines. In these forgotten corridors, whispers take on a strange clarity. It is easy to imagine armored figures pacing through them, their discussions hushed, their plans layered beneath layers of secrecy. The Templars were more than warriors. They were custodians of knowledge, protectors of mysteries that stretched far beyond the politics of medieval Europe. Here, their presence feels unusually strong, almost as if the walls still bear the imprint of their passage. It's not difficult to picture them hiding relics beneath loose stones or tucking away scrolls in cleverly disguised recesses. Items that may still lie untouched, waiting for the right moment to be found. Yet these ruins are not silent. Every gust of wind seems to carry fragments of forgotten languages, and each creak of rotten wood sounds strangely deliberate. Even the stillness has weight. It presses against the skin, urging restraint but also awakening an irresistible curiosity. The deeper one walks into these spaces, the more the line between documented history and living mystery blurs. There is something undeniably alive within the shadows, something preserved by the quiet reverence of those who once walked these halls and by those who still guard their secrets from afar. Occasionally, a faint glimmer appears, reflected sunlight catching a metal corner, a subtle shimmer hinting at a buried object. In one dimly lit chamber, half collapsed and thick with the smell of earth, fragments of parchment lie fused to stone floors, their ink faded but not entirely lost. When brushed gently, the edges reveal portions of diagrams and unfamiliar characters, perhaps part of a cipher or a map whose true nature has yet to be understood. These remnants feel like personal messages from the past, each one a fragile thread, pulling the seeker deeper into a tapestry woven hundreds of years ago. The deeper the exploration goes, the stronger the sense that the Templars engineered their secrets to survive long after their disappearance. Their knowledge was never meant to be destroyed. Instead, it was meant to sleep, protected by geography, architecture, and silence. The stone structures around these chambers are built with curious precision, angles aligned with celestial markers, hidden passageways integrated with near-mathematical accuracy. It becomes clear that the Templars thought not in decades or even centuries, but in eras. Their designs suggest intent, planning, and an understanding of how to speak to the future without uttering a single word. And beneath everything lies the unshakable feeling that someone, or something, still watches over these remnants. Villagers nearby speak in hushed tones about wandering lights, distant footsteps, and figures glimpsed only from the corner of the eye. Whether these are ghosts of history or simply the imagination straining under the weight of centuries is impossible to say. But there is one truth that becomes unmistakable. The Templar story did not end with their downfall. It simply retreated, waiting in the shadows of abandoned sanctuaries, in crypts no longer marked on maps, and in the minds of those who dare to follow the faint, invisible trail they left behind. In this part of the journey, the search transforms into something profoundly emotional. It is no longer just about solving a historical mystery. It becomes a dialogue with the past, a quiet conversation across centuries. The discovery of each relic, each symbol, each architectural quirk sparks a deeper understanding of how deliberately the Templars encoded their world. The weight of this realization settles heavily on the seeker, filling each step with anticipation but also humility. What's unfolding is not merely a quest for lost treasure or ancient maps, but an encounter with a legacy that refused to die. The stones themselves seem to whisper that the true mystery is not what the Templars hid, but why they believed the world would one day need to find it. The clay tablet sat in the dim light like a silent judge, its edges rough and uneven, the wedge-shaped symbols pressed deep into its surface centuries ago. When it was first unearthed, no one fully understood the gravity of its words. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple account of a flood. Water rising, cities swallowed, lives extinguished. But as scholars and priests began to translate the lines, the horror and wonder of its story became unmistakably clear. This was not merely myth. This was a record of events that mirrored, almost perfectly, the tale that would later appear in Genesis. The story begins with a warning. A divine voice, or perhaps a command from one of the Anunnaki, tells a man, a king or sage, to construct a vessel unlike any the world has seen. Measurements are exact, materials specified, and instructions clear, as though the writer intended no interpretation or embellishment. The tablet recounts the king's confusion, the ridicule of his people, and his eventual obedience. He works tirelessly, cutting timber, gathering reeds, and crafting a massive ship capable of surviving the fury that was to come. Outside, the skies darken. Storm clouds gather with a ferocity unmatched in human memory. The tablet emphasizes the terror. The waters roar, the winds tear, the earth shakes beneath the fury of the lords. As the translation continues, the parallels to the biblical flood become uncanny. Every step, the divine warning, the building of the ark, the gathering of animals, the unleashing of destruction, is mirrored almost line for line. And yet there are differences that make the story far stranger, far more disturbing. The tablet mentions multiple divine beings, some benevolent, some wrathful, others indifferent. They argue over who should save humanity and who should let it perish. Some wield elemental power directly, raising the rivers with their hands, diverting lightning with instruments of unknown design. These are not unseen spirits. These are beings of action, capable of reshaping the physical world with intention and precision. Inside the Vatican, when the first translations arrived, scholars were stunned. This was not a story to be treated lightly. A cardinal, privy to early drafts, reportedly wrote, "These histories precede our own sacred text by millennia, and yet their order, their logic, their details mirror what our faithful believe. How is this possible?" The question lingered in corridors, echoing off marble walls and vaulted ceilings. It was a question the Church could not answer, and for that reason it was considered dangerous. The narrative takes an even darker turn as it continues. Once the waters rise, entire cities vanish. The tablet describes buildings being torn apart as though the earth itself rebels against the arrogance of men. Fires erupt amidst the floodwaters, strange mechanical devices, interpreted by some as chariots or storm machines, appear and vanish, their purpose unclear. Survivors are few, and even they are not spared the judgment of the Anunnaki. The tablet emphasizes the selective nature of survival. Those who obeyed the commands, who understood the instructions, are spared. Those who doubted or resisted are consumed. Mercy, it seems, is conditional, dispensed according to the whims and politics of these celestial rulers. A particular line unsettled Vatican translators above all others. It reads simply, "The water receded, but the lords were displeased, for the clay of men is soft and pliable, and they feared what it may yet become." In other words, humanity was not merely tested, it was observed, experimented upon, and evaluated. There was purpose to the destruction, but it was not moral in the way the Church teaches. It was practical, almost scientific, a calibration of human potential against the will of beings who saw themselves as architects of civilization. Rumors of this tablet began to circulate among the highest echelons of the Vatican. Letters sent in strict secrecy indicate that some cardinals feared the story might undermine foundational theology. If humanity's origins were influenced or directly manipulated by beings that predated Adam and Eve, what of original sin? What of divine providence? What of the promise of salvation? To acknowledge the tablet was to acknowledge a far older, more complex origin of humankind, one that could unravel centuries of doctrinal teaching. In the 19th century, some scholars were tempted to publish their findings, but the Vatican intervened. Archives show directives to hold certain sections back from public view. The tablet was to be stored, copied sparingly, and studied only by select scholars with absolute loyalty and discretion. It was not a question of disbelief. It was a question of control. Knowledge of such magnitude could destabilize faith, provoke unrest, or worse, challenge the very structure the Church had carefully maintained for centuries. In the minds of the Church's guardians, some truths were simply too dangerous to release. The tablet itself contains layers that only further complicate the story. Embedded within the flood narrative are hints of astronomical observations, precise counts of days and nights, and references to stars and planets whose positions correspond to periods thousands of years ago. Some researchers speculate that the Anunnaki were mapping the heavens, using humanity as a canvas to observe cycles, measure time, and experiment with civilization itself. If true, this would imply that these beings were not gods in the spiritual sense, but sophisticated scientists or engineers, wielding technologies and knowledge far beyond the reach of ordinary humans. There are also subtle warnings scattered throughout the text. Symbols, almost hidden in the margins, suggest that the story is a guide, a map, and a prophecy at once. The clay tablet does not merely recount events, it instructs on survival, on the construction of vessels, on the preservation of life, and even on the cultivation of knowledge for future generations. It is both history and manual, simultaneously terrifying and invaluable. For the Vatican, the implications were seismic. Documents reveal late-night consultations, arguments whispered in secretive chambers, and deliberations on whether even acknowledging the tablet in private was too risky. Some argued it should be burned, erased, lost forever. Others contended it must be preserved, if only to maintain custody over a history that, once public, could challenge the Church's spiritual authority. A compromise was reached. The tablet would be preserved, hidden in vaults, carefully catalogued, but never spoken of in sermons, teachings, or public writings. The flood tablet, in essence, became a forbidden testament, a story that mirrored Scripture, yet was older and more complete. A narrative that described gods not as pure, moral beings, but as rulers, engineers, and experimenters. It painted humanity not as a chosen creation, but as a subject of observation, molded and tested by forces that walked like men yet possessed the power of the heavens. And it left a lingering question. If the flood was merely a test, what else did the Anunnaki manipulate? What histories, what lineages, what destinies have been hidden beneath layers of myth, theology, and silence? As the camera drifts back from the tablet, the dim light flickers across the intricate cuneiform, highlighting the care and precision of the ancient scribes. Their hands, pressed into wet clay millennia ago, captured not fantasy but memory. Memory that the world was not yet ready to face. Outside, the wind howls over the Vatican walls, carrying echoes of storms and floods past, of civilizations risen and fallen, and of secrets that will shape the next chapters of human understanding. The tablet waits quietly in its vault, a silent witness, demanding patience, reverence, and caution from those who dare to touch it. The Anunnaki story did not end with the flood, nor with their retreat to the heavens. Their legacy lingered in whispers, carvings, and the faint, stubborn pulse of memory carried through generations. For the people of Sumer, these beings were more than rulers. They were teachers, architects, and manipulators of human destiny. The clay tablets describe them distributing knowledge, agriculture, metallurgy, writing, astronomy, not as a gift to a grateful populace, but as a calculated intervention. Humanity was being shaped, tested, refined, molded to serve purposes that only the Anunnaki themselves fully understood. To the scribes who documented these events, obedience was survival, and knowledge was both a boon and a warning. The Anunnaki were not passive observers. They mined the Earth's resources with efficiency and ruthlessness, teaching humans to extract gold, copper, and precious stones. The tablets hint that these activities were not merely economic. They were fundamental to some larger cosmic agenda. Gold, in particular, is described with reverence, a substance that could sustain the heavens themselves. Some scholars speculate that the Anunnaki required it to power devices or maintain technology beyond the comprehension of humans. Whether this was literal or symbolic, the act of mining became an expression of divine intent, a lesson in obedience, labor, and devotion under watchful, almost parental scrutiny. But the Anunnaki's interactions with humans were not solely utilitarian. They intermarried or at least took interest in the human lineage, according to the texts. Certain offspring were considered special, hybrids of divine and mortal blood. These figures were often elevated to positions of power, becoming kings, priests, or warriors. In a sense, humanity itself was being selectively cultivated, an experiment in civilization. Those who inherited knowledge and favor rose, while the rest struggled under the weight of commands and decrees they barely understood. The ethical implications are staggering. Civilization itself may have been guided not by divine moral authority, but by beings with a far different conception of order, hierarchy, and destiny. The Anunnaki's legacy also extended to law and morality. The tablets contain codes of conduct, rules for governing, and instructions for maintaining harmony among the population. Some of these resemble early forms of justice, yet they often include elements designed to maintain the Anunnaki's control. Rebellion, curiosity, or deviation from instructions was met with punishment, sometimes subtle, sometimes catastrophic. One fragment reads, "The clay that resists must be reshaped or removed." It is a phrase that chills modern readers, implying not just governance, but manipulation at a level that borders on the existential. Humanity was not merely being ruled, it was being engineered. The presence of these beings, as recorded by the Sumerians, also raises profound questions about spirituality and faith. The Anunnaki were worshipped as gods, yet they acted with the capriciousness, ambition, and political savvy of humans. They had favorites and rivals, quarrels and alliances. Some tablets recount dramatic disagreements between Enki and Enlil over the fate of humans. One wanted to grant knowledge freely, the other sought strict obedience. Their decisions had consequences that affected entire cities, entire peoples. Civilization itself became a stage for their ambitions, and humanity became both audience and actor in a story much larger than itself. For centuries, these narratives lay buried beneath sand and memory, until their rediscovery in the 19th century forced a reckoning. Scholars brought the tablets to Europe, but the Vatican, ever watchful, understood their significance in a way few outsiders could. They were not simply ancient myths. They were records that challenged the most sacred assumptions of human history. If humans were shaped, uplifted, or guided by extraterrestrial beings millennia before biblical times, then the story of creation, sin, and salvation became infinitely more complex. The Church recognized the potential for upheaval. Faith could be shaken, doctrine destabilized, and authority questioned. Yet the Vatican did not destroy these records. Instead, they preserved them in secrecy, storing them in deep archives alongside papal letters, rare codices, and other items deemed too dangerous for the public eye. Here, the Anunnaki's legacy was studied carefully, analyzed, and understood as both a historical curiosity and a theological threat. Scholars pored over translations, cross-referencing events with biblical passages, noting overlaps and contradictions. They recognized the brilliance, the cunning, and sometimes the cruelty of these beings, and they feared the implications for a world that had long been told humans were solely the product of divine will. At the same time, the Anunnaki story is filled with paradox. They were creators, yet destroyers, teachers, yet tyrants, divine, yet flawed. They intervened in human affairs for reasons that often remained opaque, leaving traces of knowledge but also patterns of fear. Their gifts, writing, mathematics, agriculture, were tools for advancement, yet they were also instruments of control. They could inspire awe and devotion, yet their presence could instill terror. Humans learned to fear and revere them, to follow instructions without question, to build monuments and cities in their honor. Civilization, in many ways, was both a consequence and a reflection of Anunnaki will. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their legacy is absence. After centuries of intervention, the Anunnaki departed. They left the earth for reasons the tablets do not clearly explain. Some texts suggest dissatisfaction, disputes among themselves, or perhaps the conclusion of their experiments. Others hint at retreat to distant worlds, leaving humans to their own devices. And yet, even in their absence, the systems, knowledge, and social structures they instilled continued to influence generations. Humanity was left to inherit the consequences of divine or quasi-divine engineering, unaware that the hand guiding their civilization had long since vanished. For the Vatican, this absence is as significant as their presence. If the Anunnaki shaped humanity and then withdrew, the Church must consider what that means for divine authority. The presence of these beings, and the records of their interactions with humans, could suggest that humanity's spiritual narrative is far more complicated than traditional doctrine allows. Faith, obedience, and morality may have roots not solely in divine inspiration, but in interventions of an older, alien intelligence. The implications are staggering, and they are a primary reason why the Vatican guards the tablets so jealously. Even today, modern researchers and historians can barely grasp the full scope of the Anunnaki's influence. Tablets describe advanced knowledge that borders on technological sophistication, political manipulation across entire city-states, and the shaping of human behavior in ways that resemble modern sociology. Each tablet, each fragment, each line, carries the echo of a civilization molded, tested, and observed by beings whose motives may never be fully understood. And in these fragments, the emotional core of the story remains. Humans are not just passive observers in history, but participants in an experiment far larger than themselves, one that began in the dust and heat of ancient Mesopotamia under the watchful eyes of the Anunnaki. The camera pulls back from the shelves of clay tablets, from the faint etchings that survived millennia, to the marble halls of the Vatican where the same knowledge rests, hidden and protected. The air seems heavier here, burdened by the weight of centuries of secrecy and fear. The lesson is clear. The Anunnaki's legacy is not simply a curiosity of the past. It is a hidden architecture of human civilization, influencing thought, culture, governance, and faith in ways the world has only begun to understand. And the Church, ever aware of the power such knowledge holds, continues to guard it, knowing that revelation could reshape not just history, but the very perception of what it means to be human. By the time the 20th century dawned, the story of the Anunnaki had already crossed oceans, continents, and centuries, yet it remained buried, fragmented, and misunderstood. Outside the Vatican's walls, Europe and America were teeming with scholars, archaeologists, and adventurers hungry for knowledge. Museums displayed relics, universities held seminars, and newspapers published sensational stories of ancient kings, mysterious tablets, and lost civilizations. Popular imagination began to awaken, envisioning the dawn of humankind not as a divine spark from heaven but as the product of encounters with beings that seemed almost alien in their intellect and ambition. For most, these were myths, curiosities, or exaggerations, tales for lectures and dusty books. For the Vatican, however, they were a matter of profound consequence. The Church had long understood the power of narrative. Faith depended not only on belief but on control of the story itself. To introduce evidence of beings like the Anunnaki into public consciousness could challenge the foundations of doctrine, theology, and the very concept of divine creation. Scholars who had access to the Vatican's private collections worked in hushed rooms, translating texts and cross-referencing them with biblical accounts, noting both parallels and contradictions. One tablet might describe a flood, another the descent of skybound rulers who instructed humans in law and agriculture, while a fragment of a third suggested manipulation of the human genome. To the modern eye, these texts hint at technology and knowledge far beyond the comprehension of the time. To the Church, they were a dangerous revelation. In 1933, a particular discovery rattled the ecclesiastical hierarchy. During a cataloging expedition in the Vatican's restricted archives, a scholar uncovered an intact set of Sumerian tablets that had never been translated. These were not flood stories or creation myths alone. They contained sequences of astronomical observations, genealogies of rulers, and diagrams that some interpreted as star charts. What made them extraordinary and alarming was the precision. They were scientific records disguised as narrative, and they described events and structures centuries before modern science could have imagined them. Lines spoke of the lords of heaven, measuring stars and predicting celestial cycles with uncanny accuracy. In effect, the Anunnaki were not only rulers of humans but keepers of knowledge that could alter the perception of time, cosmology, and even humanity's place in the universe. The Vatican responded with a mix of fascination and fear. A secret committee of cardinals and scholars convened behind closed doors, often in rooms untouched by sunlight, deliberating over what to do with these revelations. Some argued for strict preservation and study, emphasizing the importance of understanding history. Others urged extreme caution, fearing that even knowledge of the Anunnaki's existence could shake the faithful, provoke heresy, or encourage dangerous speculation. A compromise was reached. The tablets would remain under the strictest secrecy, translated only by those sworn to lifelong loyalty, and never published or discussed outside the confines of the Church. For decades, this became the rule, creating a shadow archive within the Vatican itself, a hidden layer of knowledge that scholars outside could only dream of glimpsing. By mid-century, whispers began to emerge beyond the walls. Researchers in archaeology noticed strange coincidences, depictions of winged figures, advanced tools, and symbols that appeared across distant continents. Some dismissed them as myth, others as artistic expression, but a select few wondered if there was a common thread, an intelligence that had touched multiple civilizations long before the rise of recorded history. The Vatican, meanwhile, continued its quiet investigations, carefully cross-referencing these new findings with its own archives. Letters, now declassified decades later, reveal the Church's awareness that the world might one day be ready to understand the implications, but the timing had to be controlled. The Anunnaki were a story that could not yet be revealed. In 1960, an archivist stumbled upon a parchment in a side chamber, previously overlooked. The document contained accounts of Anunnaki interventions, human uprisings, and methods of observation. Even the language suggested something technological rather than mystical. The lords descend in vessels of fire. Their tools manipulate earth, water, and sky. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Vatican's inner circle. The scholar who found it wrote a note in the margin, trembling, "If this is true, the implications for humanity's understanding of creation are catastrophic." The parchment was immediately sequestered, studied in secret, and then carefully hidden again. During the 1970s, a period of rapid global exploration and archaeological expansion, a young researcher outside the Church noticed peculiar alignments between Sumerian sites, Egyptian pyramids, and ancient South American ruins. Some of the lineages and symbols were eerily similar. He published his initial findings cautiously, framing them as coincidences or cultural parallels. But he sensed a pattern. The Vatican quietly acquired copies of his research through intermediaries, comparing it against the Anunnaki records held within the archives. It became increasingly clear. If humans had indeed been guided, even subtly, by these beings, the story stretched across continents, cultures, and millennia. The Church's secrecy became more than academic caution. It became strategy. Cardinals and scholars understood that exposure could not only destabilize faith but potentially shift geopolitical and social power structures. To admit the existence of such advanced beings, or even to acknowledge the historical documents that describe them, might undermine institutions, kingdoms, and empires built on human perception of divine authority. The Anunnaki were no longer just ancient rulers. They were a test of mankind's ability to handle truth, and the Vatican had assumed custodianship of that truth. Even within the walls of the archives, the tension was palpable. Scholars reported dreams in which they encountered winged figures, voices echoing warnings, and visions of vast, celestial architecture. Some began to fear that the Anunnaki were not only historical entities but that their presence remained latent, their influence ongoing, subtle, and undetectable by ordinary means. The psychological impact on those who handled the tablets was profound, reinforcing the Church's belief that these texts must be shielded, carefully interpreted, and passed only to those capable of understanding the weight of their knowledge. And so the story of the Anunnaki entered a liminal space, visible to a few, inaccessible to the many. Public fascination continued, fed by rediscovered myths, ancient manuscripts, and tantalizing archaeological findings, yet the full scope remained hidden. The Vatican, with its meticulous care, ensured that only fragments and filtered interpretations reached the outside world, shaping curiosity while containing revelation. It became a silent guardian of history, of knowledge, and of fear. As the camera drifts through the vaults, rows of tablets and manuscripts gleam faintly in muted light. Each one carries a fragment of human destiny, a record of encounters with beings whose power, intellect, and purpose dwarfed anything the world could yet comprehend. The air is thick with centuries of silence, each breath seeming to weigh heavier than the last. Outside, the city of Rome moves through its modern rhythm. Traffic, tourists, prayers. But within these walls, time itself feels suspended. Here, the story of humanity's origins, shaped by forces both alien and godlike, waits patiently for the day when it will be understood. Until then, it remains a secret too vast, too dangerous, and too powerful for the world to grasp. By the time one reaches the outer archives of the Vatican, where sunlight barely penetrates the thick stone walls, it becomes clear that the story of the Anunnaki is not simply a tale of gods and humans. It is a story of secrecy, power, and obsession, carried through centuries by those who understood the weight of the knowledge. Here, in the quietest corridors, even the air feels heavy with anticipation, as though the building itself has absorbed the breath of scholars, cardinals, and archivists who have walked these halls for centuries, each aware that what lies here could reshape human understanding of history, faith, and destiny. In one of these chambers, a small, unassuming cabinet holds documents so fragile that even touching them requires gloves and years of careful study. These parchments and tablets contain fragments of narratives, genealogies, and instructions left by the Anunnaki themselves, or by scribes who witnessed them. The symbols are precise, intricate, and often startlingly technical. They describe vessels capable of traveling great distances, devices that manipulate elements, and knowledge of celestial mechanics that would not be replicated for thousands of years. Modern scientists examining the translations in private confirm their astonishment. Some diagrams resemble star charts, others resemble engineering schematics. The level of sophistication is beyond what could have been imagined by civilizations thought to be primitive. These are records of intellect, observation, and calculation, embedded within myth. For the Vatican, each new discovery raised a delicate question. How much should the world know? The implications were staggering. If the Anunnaki were not myth but real, if they had walked among humans, guided them, altered their destinies, and perhaps even shaped their DNA, then the story of human origins needed rewriting. The Church had long maintained that humanity was a creation of God, made in His image, destined for salvation and moral development. But these texts suggested something else entirely. Humanity as a subject of observation, an experiment carried out by beings of immense intelligence and power, who were sometimes compassionate, sometimes indifferent, sometimes cruel. To admit such a thing publicly could destabilize faith, undermine authority, and provoke panic. It was, in the eyes of the Vatican, a truth too dangerous to release. This tension played out quietly through the 20th century. Scholars assigned to the Anunnaki archives worked under conditions of extreme secrecy. They were forbidden to speak of their work outside designated chambers, and even within the Vatican, access was highly restricted. Letters, notes, and reports show that scholars feared the psychological impact of the knowledge on themselves. Dreams became vivid, filled with visions of winged figures descending from the sky, of floods and divine judgment, of instruments that bent reality in ways their minds could barely comprehend. Some feared that the Anunnaki were not entirely absent from the world, that their influence persisted in ways subtle, undetectable, and perhaps even manipulative. The tablets, in essence, were both history and warning. Outside the Vatican, however, the story of ancient civilizations was entering the public imagination in unprecedented ways. Popular books, journals, and newspapers reported on the rediscovery of Sumerian cities, on winged symbols in ancient carvings, on strange artifacts whose purposes remained mysterious. Some suggested these were evidence of alien contact. Others dismissed them as allegory or misinterpretation. The mainstream narrative, carefully curated, never acknowledged the full scope of what the Vatican knew. The Church's strategy was clear: allow fascination, but control revelation. Knowledge of the Anunnaki was a flame to be contained, not an inferno to be unleashed. At the same time, a pattern began to emerge across continents. Scholars noticed that symbols, stories, and artifacts associated with the Anunnaki appeared in disparate civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica. Some lineages, some religious structures, and even certain astronomical observations seemed to echo one another across space and time. Could this be coincidence? Or was it evidence of a single guiding influence, leaving traces in multiple cultures? Inside the Vatican, these connections were studied quietly, cross-referenced against the most obscure tablets and parchments. The conclusion, chilling in its implication, was unavoidable. If the Anunnaki were real, their impact was global, profound, and enduring. The texts themselves are unsettling in their specificity. They describe interactions that are practical, strategic, and often morally ambiguous. Humans are shaped, instructed, punished, and rewarded in ways that suggest the Anunnaki were conducting experiments on behavior, society, and cognition. One passage, translated in secrecy, notes, "The clay is soft, but the hands that shape it are firm. The future is measured in obedience and in understanding." Another reads, "The children of men may inherit knowledge, but they will not inherit wisdom unless they are guided." These lines indicate deliberate manipulation, not benevolent guidance, and they cast humanity's entire history in a different, far more complicated light. Perhaps the most chilling passages concern the Anunnaki's observation of natural disasters and environmental engineering. Tablets describe the use of controlled floods, the diversion of rivers, and the timing of celestial events to test or instruct humans. Modern readers might interpret this as myth, but the detail is consistent and methodical, suggesting not storytelling but record-keeping. The implications are vast. Humanity's history, agriculture, cities, and social structures may have been influenced directly by beings capable of controlling nature itself. It is not simply a story of gods, but of engineers, rulers, and experimenters whose technology and understanding surpassed that of any known civilization. The Vatican scholars understood that such knowledge, if exposed, could provoke existential questions. Who truly shaped humanity? Were humans autonomous creations of God, or subjects of an older, more alien intelligence? How would believers reconcile faith in divine providence with evidence of intervention by non-divine, yet incomprehensibly powerful entities? The Church's decision to remain silent was not denial. It was containment. These secrets were too profound, too destabilizing, and potentially too dangerous for a world unprepared to understand them. Even today, the Anunnaki archives are treated with reverence and fear. Researchers allowed access are carefully chosen, sworn to silence, and closely monitored. Each tablet, each fragment, each marginal note is handled with deliberate care, as though the very touch of history could awaken forces best left dormant. Some scholars report strange sensations, weight in the chest, sudden clarity of thought, vivid visions, when translating passages about the descent of the lords, the shaping of humans, or the manipulation of the Earth's elements. Whether psychological or supernatural, these experiences reinforce the gravity of the archives. The Anunnaki are not simply historical. They are, in a sense, present, their influence echoing through time. As the camera pans over the dimly lit shelves, the viewer can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down. The Anunnaki's story is not confined to Mesopotamia or the past. It is alive in these texts, encoded in symbols and preserved in silence. Every artifact, every tablet, every translation is a thread connecting humanity to a deeper, older story, one of power, knowledge, and intervention on a scale that challenges perception. Outside, Rome continues its rhythm of modernity. Streets alive, churches ringing bells. But inside, time feels suspended, as though the past itself is waiting, patient, for the world to be ready. And the question lingers, unspoken but heavy in the air. If the Anunnaki shaped humanity once, and if their influence continues in ways we cannot yet measure, then what else remains hidden? What truths about history, science, and faith have been preserved, not for revelation, but for protection? The Vatican holds these secrets with the awareness that humanity may not yet be prepared to face the magnitude of the story written in the clay, ink, and stars. The discovery of the Anunnaki tablets and the flood narratives marked only the beginning of an even deeper, more unsettling revelation. The existence of a lineage, a bloodline, that may have connected these ancient beings directly to humanity itself. As the Vatican continued its quiet study of the texts, patterns emerged. Certain names repeated across centuries and civilizations, often tied to rulers, kings, or priests who claimed divine favor. The tablets suggested something far more deliberate. The Anunnaki had not simply taught humans, built cities, or shaped agriculture. They had selectively intervened in reproduction, ensuring that certain lines carried knowledge, intelligence, and influence across generations. Humanity was not merely guided. It was engineered. The implications were staggering. If the bloodlines described in these texts were real, then the ancestry of modern humanity might carry echoes of beings far older and far more powerful than anyone had imagined. Scholars working within the Vatican's restricted archives noticed parallels between Sumerian rulers and later dynasties in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even parts of Europe. Kings and pharaohs were described as having extraordinary abilities, insight, or longevity, and some texts hinted that their authority was granted not by divine right in the conventional sense, but by direct inheritance of Anunnaki influence. These were not mere myths, the scholars realized. They were records of selective guidance and intervention. The Vatican's response was measured and deliberate. No public statement could acknowledge such a possibility. Faith could not withstand the notion that rulers or even priests might carry alien heritage. Yet within the hidden chambers of the Church, scholars debated and documented these lineages meticulously. They cross-referenced Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian records with biblical genealogies and other obscure historical accounts. Slowly, a map began to emerge, tracing lines of influence that spanned continents and millennia, suggesting a continuity of power and knowledge seeded by the Anunnaki themselves. This knowledge was intoxicating, terrifying, and forbidden all at once. Handling the tablets, scholars were acutely aware that they were glimpsing not just history, but a design that reached into the very essence of human identity. The texts hinted that certain humans were elevated to positions of power, endowed with traits that allowed them to interpret celestial signs, lead armies, or govern societies with uncanny precision. Yet the same texts warned of corruption, ambition, and rebellion. These hybrid lineages were powerful, yes, but also volatile, capable of both enlightenment and destruction. To understand the full scope of the Anunnaki's engineering was to understand the potential for human civilization to rise or collapse under the weight of inherited knowledge. Outside the Vatican, rumors of these discoveries began to echo faintly in academic circles. Archaeologists in Europe and the Middle East noted striking similarities between royal lineages across different cultures. Certain symbols, artifacts, and ceremonial practices appeared again and again, far apart in geography but consistent in meaning. The implication was impossible to ignore. A pattern of influence, deliberate and sustained, that suggested a guiding intelligence behind the rise of kings, the creation of laws, and the spread of knowledge. These researchers, unaware of the Church's archives, speculated, hypothesized, and theorized, but could not fully connect the dots. They had fragments, the Vatican held the whole puzzle. By the 1950s, some scholars working quietly within the Church began to suspect that the Anunnaki influence might extend beyond politics and culture. Certain genetic traits, recurring patterns of leadership ability, and remarkable intellectual achievements hinted at a biological inheritance. One translator noted that the tablets repeatedly mention a gift of the Lord's, something described as being passed down through generations, often encoded in blood. These gifts were not spiritual in the narrow sense. They were cognitive, strategic, and sometimes physical, allowing certain individuals to excel far beyond their peers. For the Vatican scholars, this was an extraordinary, almost dangerous discovery. To acknowledge it publicly could destabilize centuries of theological thought, human pride, and social hierarchy. The fear within the Church was palpable. Documents show that cardinals debated the morality of keeping such information secret, the responsibility of holding knowledge that could alter how humans view themselves, and the potential consequences if these revelations ever became public. Yet they also recognized the wisdom of discretion. The Anunnaki tablets were not myth. They were evidence of intervention, and intervention carried with it the power to disrupt the very foundation of belief. The Church, as custodian of faith and morality, had assumed the burden of protecting humanity from truths it might not yet be ready to confront. In parallel, the Vatican began subtle monitoring of artifacts, genealogies, and historical research outside its walls. Scholars received confidential correspondence noting emerging discoveries, suggesting connections and hinting at the existence of this bloodline influence. Occasionally, a researcher in the field would publish work that skirted dangerously close to truth, only for it to vanish quietly from circulation, cited in private as misleading or premature. The Church's efforts were not to suppress curiosity entirely but to manage the timing, scope, and interpretation of what the world could know. The bloodlines of the Anunnaki were a secret that could not yet be trusted to humanity. The more the scholars examined the tablets, the more they realized that the Anunnaki's legacy was not confined to a single era or geography. Their influence was cumulative, deliberate, and persistent. Certain individuals, deemed worthy, were elevated repeatedly in myths and histories, reinforcing the continuity of guidance and power. Other lineages were neglected, punished, or allowed to fade, emphasizing the selective nature of their intervention. Humanity, according to these texts, was both a canvas and a laboratory. Each generation carried the potential to inherit knowledge and power, yet also bore the consequences of rebellion, failure, or ignorance. The Anunnaki's hand was subtle, precise, and ultimately inescapable. As the centuries progressed, the narrative remained hidden in plain sight. Kings, emperors, and leaders of great civilizations may have been unaware of their origins. Yet the traits that the Anunnaki supposedly seated within them, intelligence, strategic insight, creativity, persisted. The Vatican scholars tracked these patterns meticulously, comparing written histories, oral traditions, and obscure texts. They found threads of similarity, repeated themes of divine favor, and exceptional human capacity that seemed to defy explanation. The conclusion was both thrilling and terrifying. The Anunnaki bloodline had endured, quietly shaping the course of civilization from behind the veil of myth and legend. By the time modernity arrived, the Church's understanding of the Anunnaki bloodline had reached a complex, almost obsessive depth. Scholars within the Vatican knew more than any public academic, more than any historian or archaeologist. They held knowledge of lineage, inheritance, and influence that spanned millennia. And yet, in keeping with centuries of cautious discretion, this knowledge was never spoken aloud. It remained a guarded truth, accessible only to a select few who understood the weight, the responsibility, and the danger of the revelation. The question that lingered in the minds of those who studied the tablets in secret was the same question that had haunted generations of Vatican scholars. If these bloodlines truly existed, if they shaped human history from the shadows, then who among us today carries their influence? And what would it mean if the world ever discovered it? The tablets offered no easy answers, only fragments, patterns, and implications that stretched across time. Humanity, it seemed, was far older, far more engineered, and far more influenced than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The trail of the Anunnaki, as recorded in the secret archives of the Vatican, does not end with bloodlines or flood narratives. It stretches into the hidden architecture of civilization itself, written not in ink or stone alone, but in monuments, temples, and structures whose design defies conventional understanding. Scholars working in the restricted vaults noted patterns, mathematical precision, celestial alignment, and repeated motifs that suggest the Anunnaki left more than just instruction. They left a blueprint for humanity, a map encoded into the very fabric of its cities. These were not accidents of design or simple aesthetic choices. They were deliberate markers, a code intended for those who could interpret it. And the more one studies these structures, the more it becomes clear that they were designed to endure far beyond the lifespans of men, waiting for the right generation to decode them. The pyramids of Egypt, for instance, are not simply tombs, nor are ziggurats merely places of worship. According to the Vatican's hidden research, the dimensions, angles, and orientations of these monuments correspond to astronomical events recorded in the Sumerian tablets. They align with solstices, planetary positions, and even celestial bodies that are now only faintly visible to modern instruments. The Anunnaki were mapping the heavens as they mapped humanity, encoding knowledge that could survive millennia and instruct the future. Every stone, every chamber, every corridor becomes a testament not to human ingenuity alone, but to guidance, perhaps even direct intervention. For the Vatican scholars who study these structures, this realization transforms the monuments from marvels of architecture into instruments of communication, embedded with purpose beyond ordinary comprehension. Some texts even suggest that the Anunnaki employed humans as instruments to build these structures, guiding entire civilizations with subtle but powerful influence. Labor, resources, and knowledge were distributed in ways that maximized efficiency, ensured fidelity to the Anunnaki design, and simultaneously tested human capabilities. The texts describe overseers and teachers, individuals chosen for their bloodline, intelligence, or skill, who acted as intermediaries between humans and the Anunnaki. These intermediaries instructed, corrected, and sometimes punished, ensuring that the work proceeded according to precise specifications. The monuments themselves, therefore, are as much a record of divine or alien planning as they are human achievement. They embody a dual legacy, human effort shaped under the influence of an intelligence far beyond human understanding. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurats tell a similar story. Scholars note recurring patterns in design, repetition of sacred numbers, and the incorporation of symbols that appear nowhere else in ordinary architecture. Tablets found alongside these structures suggest that the ziggurats functioned as more than religious centers. They were observation points, teaching tools, and perhaps even energy conductors of a kind unknown to modern science. The Vatican's restricted archives indicate that some of these structures were aligned with cosmic cycles, amplifying the significance of celestial events and embedding these cycles into the consciousness of the civilizations below. The Anunnaki's influence, therefore, was not limited to historical events or bloodlines. It was encoded into the physical world, observable yet hidden, obvious yet indecipherable without context. Even across the globe in the Americas, traces of these patterns appear. Ancient pyramids, ceremonial platforms, and astronomical observatories show uncanny alignment with celestial bodies and recurring symbols reminiscent of Mesopotamian design. The Vatican scholars, through meticulous cross-comparison, noted that these patterns could not be dismissed as coincidence. Across vast distances, civilizations separated by thousands of miles and centuries display similar engineering principles, mathematical precision, and symbolic resonance. If the Anunnaki did exist, the implication is that their influence was global, pervasive, and enduring, a force shaping humanity on multiple continents, testing, teaching, and observing the outcomes. The texts describe a dual purpose for these constructions. On one level, they were monuments of worship, a means of demonstrating reverence to the Anunnaki. On another, they functioned as repositories of knowledge, embedding lessons in geometry, astronomy, and cosmology into tangible forms. By studying these structures, future generations could access the wisdom and observations of the Anunnaki without direct instruction. This foresight suggests a level of strategic thinking beyond human comprehension, a calculated plan to preserve knowledge across millennia, ensuring that even when direct contact ceased, the imprint of their influence remained embedded in the world. Perhaps most unsettling is the suggestion that the monuments also served as tests, both practical and symbolic. Those who could decipher the alignments, understand the encoded mathematics, and interpret the patterns were deemed worthy of higher knowledge. Those who could not were left with awe, fear, or misinterpretation, reinforcing the hierarchical control the Anunnaki exerted over human understanding. Humanity, in this sense, was continuously evaluated, its capacity for comprehension tested across generations. Civilization itself became a laboratory, its cities, monuments, and social structures instruments in an experiment far beyond ordinary imagination. The Vatican scholars, reading the tablets and examining these structures in secret, note the intentional repetition of certain symbols, numbers, and alignments across different cultures and eras. It is as though the Anunnaki anticipated that humanity would scatter across the globe, yet designed a consistent framework through which knowledge could survive, evolve, and be rediscovered. This framework includes both architecture and ritual, geometry and cosmology, astronomy and ethics. Everything becomes interconnected, a subtle, elegant web linking the heavens, the earth, and the human mind. The Anunnaki's intervention was not chaotic. It was deliberate, strategic, and profoundly intelligent. The psychological impact on scholars who study these patterns in secret is intense. Many report feelings of vertigo, as though standing on the edge of understanding something vast, a truth so immense it challenges the very perception of reality. There is a sense that these monuments, these symbols, and these alignments are alive with meaning, waiting for the observer to comprehend them fully. For the Vatican, this knowledge is simultaneously a treasure and a burden. To reveal it could illuminate human history in ways unimaginable, but it could also destabilize faith, provoke panic, and invite chaos. Even today, as researchers and archaeologists around the world uncover more about these monuments, the full purpose of their design remains elusive. Only within the Vatican, in the restricted archives, does a comprehensive understanding begin to emerge. There, scholars compare tablets, structures, and celestial maps, gradually piecing together a vision of a world subtly guided by intelligence far older and more sophisticated than humanity itself. The Anunnaki, according to these studies, left a legacy that is physical, intellectual, and spiritual. A blueprint that continues to influence the development of civilizations millennia after their departure. In the quiet of the archive, one can almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down. Stone, parchment, and ink carry messages intended to outlast the ephemeral nature of human memory. Monuments across continents act as markers, tests, and lessons, encoded with purpose and precision. The Anunnaki, through these structures, left a silent but enduring message. Humanity is capable of greatness, but only if it learns to read, understand, and respect the wisdom embedded in the world itself. And for the Vatican, guardianship of this knowledge is not merely an academic responsibility. It is a sacred duty, preserving truths too powerful, too transformative, and too dangerous for the world to confront unprepared. By the time one examines the hidden corridors of the Vatican, it becomes evident that the story of the Anunnaki extends far beyond history, architecture, or celestial observation. It weaves itself into the very fabric of faith, challenging what humanity believes about divinity, morality, and destiny. Among the most carefully guarded manuscripts is a series of translations that describe not just actions and interventions but the internal logic of these beings, their desires, ambitions, and motivations. They are not gods in the sense that humans understand. They are strategists, scientists, and overseers with agendas that transcend morality, compassion, or ethics as humans know them. The Anunnaki observed humanity, manipulated its development, and intervened in ways calculated to achieve results, not devotion. The texts describe their interventions as systematic, often guided by a principle of observation and experimentation. Cities were built, destroyed, or repurposed. Rulers were elevated or removed according to compliance with instructions or the potential to inherit knowledge. Certain families were watched, nurtured, or manipulated across generations, ensuring continuity of influence. The Vatican scholars, poring over these manuscripts, recognized a pattern. The Anunnaki were both teachers and experimenters, and humanity was their subject, willingly or not. Morality, they realized, was subordinate to design. Humanity's history, then, is not merely shaped by chance, circumstance, or divine providence. It is curated, monitored, and manipulated at a level previously unimagined. One particularly startling passage describes the Anunnaki's approach to governance. It reads, "The cities are clay, the rulers are reeds. Strength lies in direction, not will." In other words, humans are malleable, capable of leadership, insight, and progress, but only when guided. The manuscripts repeatedly emphasize that disobedience or ignorance invites catastrophe. Floods, disease, and famine are described not merely as punishment but as controlled variables in an experiment spanning millennia. Scholars within the Vatican interpret this as a kind of cosmic laboratory, a moral and intellectual test measured across generations. Humanity, in essence, is both subject and instrument, evaluated continually against a standard beyond ordinary comprehension. The Anunnaki's presence is particularly emphasized in the texts concerning celestial cycles. Their timing was precise, aligning interventions with astronomical events, eclipses, and planetary positions. Certain rituals, observances, and constructions were required to harness or align with these cycles. According to the manuscripts, failure to follow these instructions had consequences, not because of divine wrath in the human sense, but because the natural and cosmic forces the Anunnaki manipulated were disrupted. In other words, obedience was survival, insight was rewarded, and ignorance or arrogance carried real-world consequences beyond human understanding. The Vatican scholars also noted an unexpected element in these records: emotion. The Anunnaki are described as feeling pride, frustration, and even compassion, though these emotions were always tempered by strategy and logic. One fragment reads, "The Lord's eyes burn not with anger, but with disappointment. Knowledge unheeded is a loss to the cycle." This is a far cry from the wrathful gods of traditional theology. These are beings for whom human development is a project, a continuum of observation and instruction, and where outcomes are measured in growth, compliance, and learning rather than moral judgment. Humanity, in this perspective, becomes a reflection of the Anunnaki's method, a civilization engineered with purpose, resilience, and consequence. The manuscripts further describe a hierarchy among the Anunnaki themselves. Some are described as benevolent, seeking to uplift and instruct humanity, while others are indifferent or even hostile, concerned only with outcomes or experiments. These divisions sometimes led to conflicts, the texts suggest, disputes that played out in human history as wars, famines, or political upheaval. In effect, human civilizations became the stage for a cosmic drama, where the actors, kings, priests, and commoners alike, were guided by forces that humans could barely perceive. The Vatican scholars recognized that understanding this dynamic requires a fundamental shift in perception. History is not random, nor solely divine. It is a confluence of human action and extraterrestrial oversight. Equally significant is the manuscript's insistence on secrecy and protection of knowledge. Certain instructions were meant to be encoded, hidden, or taught only to select individuals, those deemed capable of comprehension and responsibility. The Anunnaki, the texts suggest, understood the danger of unrestrained knowledge, aware that humanity might misuse it or collapse under its weight. This theme resonates within the Vatican's custodianship. The Church, in guarding the Anunnaki archives, is not merely preserving history. It is preserving the delicate balance between revelation and chaos, knowledge and comprehension. The texts themselves warn that premature exposure of certain truths can lead to ruin, misunderstanding, or spiritual collapse. Within these hidden manuscripts, scholars also find records of interaction with other civilizations. The Anunnaki are described as travelers, observers, and manipulators across continents and centuries, leaving marks that endure in symbols, rituals, and monuments. They teach selectively, reward selectively, and intervene strategically, ensuring that knowledge survives while chaos is mitigated. The Vatican recognizes that these records, while ancient, describe a framework that echoes throughout human civilization. The rise and fall of empires, the elevation of kings, the spread of knowledge and culture, all part of a continuum influenced, measured, and shaped by beings whose perspective transcends human lifespans. Psychologically, scholars who have studied these texts report profound effects. Many describe feelings of awe, fear, and disorientation, as though standing at the edge of understanding something vast and ancient. Some report visions or intuitions about events, places, and figures from millennia past, as if the manuscripts themselves carry an imprint of the Anunnaki consciousness. The Vatican's approach is rigorous. Scholars are carefully chosen, closely monitored, and required to maintain silence, ensuring that exposure to these records does not produce harm, misunderstanding, or panic. It is not superstition, but caution informed by centuries of observation. Knowledge, especially knowledge of beings as powerful and consequential as the Anunnaki, can be as dangerous as it is enlightening. The manuscripts also challenge conventional theology, raising questions about creation, divine intent, and human purpose. If the Anunnaki played a direct role in shaping humanity, then traditional notions of free will, divine image, and moral authority are complicated. The Vatican scholars do not dismiss faith. Rather, they reinterpret it within a broader framework. The existence of the Anunnaki does not negate divine providence, they argue, but it adds a layer of complexity. Humanity's story is both guided and influenced, shaped by forces beyond ordinary perception, yet still responsible for choices, consequences, and moral development. Faith becomes a dialogue with multiple layers of influence, history, and observation. As the camera drifts through the dimly lit archive, the tablets and manuscripts glint faintly under the sparse light. Each line, each symbol, each encoded instruction is a thread connecting humanity to something far older, far more sophisticated, and far more powerful than conventional history allows. The Anunnaki's interventions, recorded in precision and hidden from the world, suggest a design that is practical, moral, and strategic, a blueprint of civilization that tests, guides, and evaluates human potential. And the Vatican, as the steward of this knowledge, carries a weight that transcends ordinary history, ethics, or scholarship. The burden of knowing the truth of humanity's origins, the truth of divine or extraterrestrial intervention, and the responsibility of preserving it for a world not yet ready to confront it fully. The manuscripts and tablets make it clear that the Anunnaki's influence did not end with the construction of monuments or the establishment of bloodlines. It extended into the very structures of human knowledge, belief, and culture. Within the Vatican's restricted archives, scholars have discovered a consistent thread connecting mathematics, astronomy, religion, and governance across civilizations. The Anunnaki did not merely instruct in practical skills. They encoded principles, ethics, and cosmic understanding into the framework of society. Every temple, every ziggurat, every ceremonial alignment was part of a curriculum designed not only to instruct but to test, guiding humans toward comprehension while simultaneously limiting the dangers of unrestrained discovery. One of the most compelling examples comes from a set of tablets describing the Anunnaki's observations of human cognition and learning. They describe children being observed from birth, their abilities measured, their behaviors corrected, their minds expanded through deliberate challenge and instruction. Education, as these texts suggest, was never neutral. Knowledge was power, and the Anunnaki ensured that power was distributed selectively, favoring those capable of understanding, absorbing, and applying it. This stratification was not merely social, it was genetic, intellectual, and spiritual. Humans were being molded to inherit a legacy they did not yet understand. Their minds sharpened, their senses honed, their destinies guided by unseen hands. The Vatican scholars note that this deliberate shaping extended into law and morality. Ancient codes, often attributed to human kings or divine inspiration, bear striking resemblance to directives found in the tablets. Justice, fairness, and governance were not abstract principles but practical tools for maintaining order and ensuring the Anunnaki's designs were realized. Rebellion, ignorance, and negligence were met with consequences, often described in terms of disaster or misfortune. Humans were simultaneously empowered and constrained, learning through structured trials, experiencing reward and punishment in ways that the Anunnaki calculated to produce optimal outcomes. Civilization, in this sense, is both human achievement and evidence of deliberate design. Perhaps most unsettling is the suggestion that the Anunnaki influenced human spirituality itself. Religious rituals, hierarchies, and sacred texts appear across civilizations, often sharing motifs, symbols, and practices that transcend geography. Scholars within the Vatican have traced similarities between Sumerian, Egyptian, and later Judeo-Christian rituals, noting an uncanny consistency in structure and purpose. Certain practices, sacrifices, initiations, ceremonies of purification, appear to be methods of aligning human perception with cosmic cycles, designed to train the mind and spirit for comprehension of broader truths. Faith, under the guidance of the Anunnaki, was both a tool and a test, a mechanism to shape society while preparing select individuals for higher understanding. The manuscripts also reveal the Anunnaki's preoccupation with observation. They monitored human behavior, environmental patterns, and social dynamics with meticulous precision. Cities, armies, and populations were evaluated continuously, and interventions were applied to correct deviations from planned outcomes. Scholars describe passages that detail how minor adjustments, moving a river, altering a harvest cycle, guiding a ruler, could have cascading effects across generations. Civilization itself was a laboratory, and the Anunnaki were its invisible architects, engineers, and supervisors. Even when they departed physically, their influence persisted through encoded knowledge, monuments, and the carefully curated structures of culture. In the Vatican, scholars also observed that these texts suggest a level of foresight that borders on the prophetic. Certain instructions appear to anticipate future events, natural cycles, and human tendencies with remarkable accuracy. The Anunnaki appear to understand the limits of human comprehension and the dangers of premature exposure to knowledge. Thus, the messages were often cryptic, encoded in symbols, or embedded within rituals and architecture. It is as though the Anunnaki created a layered system of knowledge, some accessible to the masses, some reserved for the initiated, and some so deeply encoded that only those with extraordinary insight could fully comprehend it. The manuscripts caution that misunderstanding or misapplication of this knowledge can be catastrophic. The Church, in safeguarding these texts, recognizes both the value and danger of disclosure. Scholars are allowed access only under strict conditions. They must be psychologically stable, morally responsible, and capable of handling revelations that challenge foundational assumptions about humanity, divinity, and history. Notes from Vatican archives reveal that even the act of translation can induce profound psychological effects. Some scholars report visions of celestial beings, intense emotional experiences, or a sense of temporal dislocation when engaging with certain passages. These reactions are interpreted as both a response to the depth of the material and a possible echo of the Anunnaki's own presence, an imprint of intelligence, strategy, and observation embedded within the manuscripts themselves. One of the more fascinating aspects of these texts is the Anunnaki's treatment of human creativity. They are described as encouraging art, music, and storytelling, but always in ways that served broader objectives. Art was not merely expression. It was a method of encoding knowledge, transmitting moral lessons, or preparing minds for comprehension of complex concepts. Music and rhythm, the texts suggest, were tools for aligning human perception with cosmic cycles, creating resonance that amplified cognitive and emotional development. Stories, myths, and legends were both entertainment and instruction, a way of preserving wisdom across generations without exposing it in ways that could overwhelm or corrupt. Every cultural product, in this sense, carries the imprint of design hidden in plain sight. The manuscripts also hint at the Anunnaki's experiments in human governance and leadership. Certain individuals were trained to interpret celestial signs, manage cities, and wield influence over populations. Others were tested through hardship, observation, or trial to measure resilience, intelligence, and adaptability. The Vatican scholars note that this selective intervention produced a civilization capable of extraordinary achievement, but also vulnerable to misuse, corruption, or rebellion. Leadership, wisdom, and morality were both inherited and cultivated, guided by forces unseen but meticulously documented in the tablets. Humanity, therefore, exists as both participant and subject in a vast, orchestrated experiment. Even as the Anunnaki's physical presence waned, their instructions persisted in hidden forms. Symbols, architecture, rituals, and encoded manuscripts serve as a continuous guide, a network of knowledge and influence that stretches across time. The Vatican's custodianship is, in effect, a continuation of the Anunnaki strategy, ensuring that knowledge survives, that it is understood by those prepared to handle it, and that it is not misused or misinterpreted. Scholars, in working with these texts, become part of a lineage of observation and understanding, bridging the gap between past interventions and present comprehension. It is a sacred duty, fraught with responsibility, requiring both intellectual rigor and spiritual discernment. The manuscripts also caution against hubris. Knowledge, power, and insight, while transformative, carry inherent risk. Misapplication, misunderstanding, or misuse can lead to societal collapse, moral degradation, or personal catastrophe. The Anunnaki appear to have understood this implicitly, designing their interventions to test not only skill and intellect, but restraint, humility, and responsibility. The Vatican recognizes that this warning is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. In a world capable of rapid technological advancement, the ethical lessons embedded within these texts resonate with new urgency, emphasizing that knowledge is a gift and a burden, a tool and a trial. Within the quiet halls of the archives, the weight of these revelations presses upon scholars. The manuscripts are not mere history. They are a living dialogue, a bridge between human development and a larger, more sophisticated intelligence. They challenge assumptions about creation, power, morality, and destiny, while simultaneously offering guidance, caution, and insight. Humanity, according to these texts, is both the product of design and the arbiter of its own future. A civilization tested, observed, and shaped by forces beyond ordinary perception. The Vatican's role is to ensure that this knowledge survives intact, that it is interpreted responsibly, and that it remains a guiding light rather than a source of chaos. As the camera drifts through the dimly lit archives, the manuscripts glow faintly under the sparse illumination, each symbol and line a testament to a legacy hidden for millennia. The Anunnaki's presence is felt not only in history but in the patterns, structures, and frameworks that continue to shape human understanding. Faith, morality, knowledge, and civilization itself are threads woven into a vast, cosmic design. And the Vatican, guardian of these truths, holds the key to understanding a story far older, far more intricate, and far more consequential than humanity has ever imagined. Even as the Vatican safeguarded the manuscripts and tablets, a growing tension emerged between secrecy and discovery. Outside its stone walls, the world was changing, and the whispers of Anunnaki influence had begun to seep into public consciousness. Archaeologists uncovered ancient cities, pyramids, and ziggurats, often noting astronomical alignments and architectural precision that defied conventional explanations. Journalists, independent researchers, and amateur historians began connecting dots that mainstream academia was not yet ready to acknowledge. These discoveries were fragmentary, often speculative, yet they hinted at a truth long hidden. The Anunnaki had left an indelible mark on human history, encoded in stone, ritual, and story. Within the Vatican, the sense of urgency intensified. Scholars recognized that the world might soon be capable of glimpsing the truth, whether it was ready or not. One particularly compelling artifact came from a remote excavation in Mesopotamia. A fragmentary tablet that referenced celestial travel, governance of humans, and instructions for constructing instruments whose purpose remained obscure. While scholars in the field marveled at its age and craftsmanship, the Vatican understood its full significance. The tablet not only corroborated other records held in secret, but also provided context for understanding cryptic passages about leadership, morality, and observation. In the hands of the uninformed, this artifact could inspire awe but also misinterpretation. The Church's response was swift. Scholars were tasked with preserving, translating, and interpreting these finds under strict conditions, ensuring that any public discussion would remain careful, measured, and incomplete. The Vatican's archives reveal a deliberate strategy in managing knowledge. While allowing limited academic study of artifacts and manuscripts, the Church carefully controlled access, framing discoveries within narratives acceptable to mainstream scholarship. Scholars were trained to contextualize findings without revealing the underlying connections to the Anunnaki. This balancing act required patience, foresight, and discipline. Scholars understood that humanity was at a crossroads. Too much exposure, too soon, could spark skepticism, fear, or even panic. The Anunnaki's legacy, if revealed improperly, could destabilize not just academic institutions but belief systems, governments, and social cohesion. The Vatican had, in essence, become a guardian of history and a mediator between revelation and comprehension. Meanwhile, the manuscripts describe the Anunnaki's fascination with human ambition and curiosity. They observe that humans naturally seek knowledge, question authority, and challenge the limits of understanding. The texts emphasize that these traits are both a gift and a hazard. Humans are capable of extraordinary innovation, yet susceptible to hubris and destruction. In practical terms, this meant that civilizations were constantly being tested. Cities, rulers, and empires were observed, and interventions were applied to nudge outcomes in desired directions. The Vatican scholars realized that the patterns of history, the rise and fall of empires, the spread of knowledge, the cycles of war and peace, could be interpreted as part of a broader experiment conducted by the Anunnaki. Humanity was not random. It was observed, guided, and refined over millennia. A striking example comes from the examination of sacred geometry embedded in ancient architecture. Structures across continents share recurring ratios, alignments, and proportions that are not only aesthetically impressive but mathematically precise. Scholars within the Vatican understand that these patterns are far more than coincidences. They encode astronomical knowledge, ethical principles, and lessons in engineering and observation. The text suggests that humans were expected to learn from these patterns, gradually developing comprehension of natural laws, cosmic cycles, and the interconnectedness of existence. Architecture, therefore, was simultaneously practical, symbolic, and pedagogical, a deliberate tool of instruction and observation left behind by the Anunnaki. The Vatican archives also reveal cautionary lessons about the misuse of knowledge. Certain texts describe civilizations that failed to interpret the guidance correctly or attempted to harness it for personal power. Catastrophe followed. Floods, famine, conflict, and societal collapse were recorded as consequences of hubris, misunderstanding, or defiance. The scholars who study these records emphasize that the Anunnaki did not act out of cruelty. Their interventions were measured, strategic, and consequential. Humanity, in essence, was learning the same lessons that the Anunnaki had mastered long before. That power without understanding leads to ruin, that knowledge requires responsibility, and that observation is the key to wisdom. In addition to observing human behavior, the manuscripts describe the Anunnaki's manipulation of natural forces. Rivers were diverted, floods controlled, and agriculture guided according to precise instructions. Some passages even suggest the use of energy or technology unknown to humans, capable of influencing weather patterns and environmental outcomes. These interventions were designed to sustain populations, test social cohesion, or instruct rulers in the responsible use of power. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence of sophisticated understanding and practical experimentation. Humans were not merely passive recipients of divine will. They were participants in a calculated experiment, navigating the consequences of both obedience and error. The documents also hint at the Anunnaki's methods of encoding moral and ethical instruction. Stories, myths, and legends carry embedded lessons, often disguised as entertainment, ritual, or religious practice. Scholars note that these narratives, repeated across cultures, carry consistent messages about justice, leadership, courage, and restraint. Humanity was being trained to recognize patterns, anticipate outcomes, and navigate complexity, all through indirect observation and interpretation. The Vatican's role in studying these texts is thus not merely academic. It is custodial, ensuring that humanity can access these lessons responsibly when the time is right, without being overwhelmed by their full implications prematurely. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these manuscripts is the suggestion of ongoing influence. While the Anunnaki are no longer physically present, their encoded systems, rituals, architecture, governance structures, and genetic legacies persist across time. Scholars within the Vatican recognize that humanity's achievements, discoveries, and social structures may still be shaped by the subtle framework they left behind. Even modern science, when it encounters anomalies or unexplained insights, may be tapping into echoes of this ancient intelligence. The Anunnaki's hand, though invisible, remains present in the patterns of history, in the architecture of civilizations, and in the potential of human understanding. The psychological impact on scholars who study these records is profound. Many report feelings of vertigo, awe, and existential questioning, as if encountering a truth that simultaneously illuminates and overwhelms. The knowledge is intoxicating yet terrifying, offering glimpses of human potential while revealing the fragility of perception. The Vatican maintains strict protocols, emphasizing reflection, meditation, and ethical responsibility. Scholars are reminded that they are custodians, not proprietors of knowledge, a sacred trust that extends beyond personal ambition or recognition. The archives are a living testament to the enduring complexity of human history and the responsibility of stewardship. In examining these texts, it becomes evident that the Anunnaki did not act arbitrarily. Their interventions were guided by principles, observation, and strategic foresight. They sought to shape humanity in ways that preserved both knowledge and ethical responsibility, ensuring continuity of culture, governance, and cosmic understanding. The Vatican's archives, hidden from public view, provide a unique window into this design, revealing patterns, instructions, and consequences that span millennia. Humanity, in this view, is both a subject and participant in a vast, orchestrated continuum of development, guided by forces beyond ordinary perception, yet inseparably tied to the choices and actions of each generation. As the camera drifts across the dimly lit shelves of the Vatican archives, the manuscripts and tablets glimmer faintly under the soft illumination. Each symbol, each line of text, each carefully preserved artifact carries with it centuries of observation, instruction, and consequence. The Anunnaki's influence is not just historical. It is encoded in the very structure of human knowledge, morality, and civilization. Scholars entrusted with these records carry the responsibility of interpreting, preserving, and ultimately deciding how or when to share these truths. It is a burden of extraordinary weight, one that requires both intellectual mastery and ethical discernment. And as the viewer contemplates the scope of this hidden knowledge, one question lingers, heavy and unspoken. If humanity has been guided, observed, and shaped by an intelligence far older and more sophisticated than itself, then what does it truly mean to be human? Are we autonomous creators, or participants in a carefully designed continuum? The Vatican's archives do not provide easy answers, only fragments, patterns, and glimpses into a history far richer, more complex, and more extraordinary than conventional understanding allows. The Anunnaki, through their meticulous observation and encoded interventions, continue to shape not only the past but the potential of every human mind, every civilization, and every generation to come. The deeper one delves into the Vatican archives, the more apparent it becomes that the Anunnaki were not only architects of human civilization but also manipulators of human perception. Their influence, encoded in symbols, rituals, and artifacts, was designed to be discovered gradually, over generations, by those prepared to comprehend it. The manuscripts describe a layered approach to instruction. Knowledge was segmented, obscured, and protected, ensuring that only the capable, or the persistent, could unlock its full significance. Humanity was being trained, not merely taught, as if each generation were a student in a cosmic classroom spanning millennia. And the Vatican, as the guardian of these records, functions as both the keeper of the keys and the interpreter of lessons too dangerous or profound for unmediated exposure. Among the most striking revelations is the Anunnaki's understanding of human cognition and the limits of perception. The texts repeatedly emphasize that knowledge without context can be destructive, that insight unearned or misapplied leads to chaos, and that understanding requires patience, observation, and moral discipline. Certain symbols, for example, recur across civilizations, often in forms that appear mundane at first glance but reveal profound meaning when viewed in conjunction with celestial alignments or architectural patterns. These symbols act as nodes of information, encoded to be discovered progressively, a method designed to cultivate wisdom rather than mere information. Scholars in the Vatican have spent decades decoding these interconnections, often uncovering insights that defy contemporary logic or conventional historical understanding. The manuscripts also reveal an unsettling dimension: the Anunnaki's deliberate manipulation of power structures. Leaders, kings, and priests were not elevated arbitrarily. They were chosen based on their aptitude for comprehension, their ability to interpret signs, and their alignment with the Anunnaki's strategic objectives. Bloodlines, as previously noted, were meticulously observed and nurtured, and those individuals most capable of insight were provided with subtle guidance through mentors, omens, and encoded teachings. Civilization, therefore, becomes a reflection of cosmic intelligence, with leadership, innovation, and cultural development orchestrated by an influence invisible to ordinary perception. This is a reality that both awes and terrifies, suggesting that human agency, while significant, has always been entwined with an intelligence far greater than itself. Equally compelling is the suggestion that the Anunnaki anticipated human curiosity, rebellion, and innovation. Far from stifling initiative, they allowed humans to experiment, fail, and learn, observing the consequences with meticulous attention. Civilizations that interpreted guidance correctly thrived. Those that failed were left with cautionary tales, often embedded in myths, rituals, or historical records. Catastrophe was not punishment in the moral sense but a natural consequence of misalignment with the instructions encoded in culture, architecture, and governance. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence of the Anunnaki's foresight. They understood the trajectory of human development, balancing instruction with the necessity of independent discovery, ensuring that humanity evolved both intellectually and ethically under observation. The texts also illuminate the Anunnaki's influence on technological development. While early humans lacked the tools to achieve what the Anunnaki envisioned directly, the manuscripts describe methods of encoding knowledge that would later manifest in advances in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Knowledge was layered, some accessible immediately, some awaiting the development of tools or techniques capable of comprehension. The precise alignments of pyramids, the sophisticated irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, and the encoded astronomical observations are all examples of this deliberate seeding of knowledge. Humanity, the Anunnaki understood, needed time, observation, and practice to reach the point where abstract instruction could be applied effectively. The Vatican scholars recognized that this strategy ensured the survival of knowledge while mitigating the risk of misuse. Another dimension revealed in these records is the Anunnaki's ethical framework. While human morality was often secondary to strategic objectives, the texts emphasize principles of balance, responsibility, and consequence. Leadership, knowledge, and creativity carried inherent duties. Misuse or neglect could destabilize society, disrupt natural cycles, or provoke disaster. The Anunnaki appear to have tested humanity not simply to observe outcomes but to cultivate ethical discernment, resilience, and foresight. The Vatican's custodians of the manuscripts note that these lessons remain relevant, warning modern society of the dangers inherent in unrestrained ambition, technological overreach, or moral negligence. Knowledge, the Anunnaki insisted, is inseparable from responsibility. The manuscripts frequently highlight the interplay between human perception and cosmic cycles. Observations of the stars, planetary alignments, and celestial events were not merely scientific. They were lessons in timing, pattern recognition, and consequence. The Vatican scholars note that ancient rituals, religious observances, and architectural designs often corresponded precisely to these cycles, suggesting that humans were being trained to perceive and interact with a reality far larger than their immediate environment. Aligning human activity with celestial patterns was both practical, influencing agriculture and survival, and pedagogical, teaching humans to recognize order, causality, and the interconnection between the earthly and the cosmic. This integration of practical and metaphysical instruction is emblematic of the Anunnaki's approach. Precise, layered, and enduring. In the Vatican archives, scholars have also observed the deliberate encoding of contingency plans. Civilizations that misinterpreted instructions or failed to follow guidance were provided with alternate pathways, subtle warnings embedded in myth, ritual, or architectural design. The Anunnaki appear to have understood the unpredictability of human behavior and designed a flexible system of guidance to maximize the likelihood of success. Catastrophe was neither arbitrary nor punitive. It was a measure of alignment with the broader plan. Scholars note that the layered complexity of these interventions reflects a consciousness that comprehends both long-term consequences and immediate action, capable of orchestrating events across centuries and continents with precision and adaptability. Perhaps most astonishing is the suggestion that the Anunnaki intended these lessons to endure indefinitely, transcending cultural, temporal, and linguistic barriers. The recurrence of symbols, numerical patterns, and architectural principles across disparate civilizations suggests a deliberate effort to encode universal knowledge in forms resilient to the decay of language, the collapse of societies, and the passage of millennia. Humanity, the texts imply, was being guided toward the realization of latent potential, with each generation inheriting a puzzle, a challenge, and a set of tools to unlock understanding. The Vatican scholars recognize that this foresight is extraordinary. It is not merely the preservation of knowledge, but the orchestration of a multimillennial educational framework, one that continues to influence human development even in the modern era. In examining these texts, one cannot ignore the psychological dimension. Scholars who spend prolonged periods studying the manuscripts report experiences of temporal dislocation, intense insight, and profound emotional response. Some describe visions of ancient cities, celestial events, or Anunnaki figures, often accompanied by a sense of continuity, purpose, and observation. These experiences are interpreted as either a resonance of the Anunnaki's encoded intelligence or as the human mind aligning with the cognitive patterns embedded in the texts. In either case, the effect is undeniable. The manuscripts are not inert records but active instruments of perception, guiding understanding while demanding reflection, humility, and responsibility. Finally, the Vatican scholars underscore the enduring mystery of the Anunnaki's ultimate purpose. While the manuscripts provide patterns, instructions, and examples, the final objectives remain elusive. Were they testing humanity, cultivating it, or simply observing as a distant intelligence might monitor an experiment? The answer is unclear, yet the implications are profound. Human history, civilization, and achievement are intertwined with a legacy of observation, instruction, and subtle guidance. The Anunnaki's influence is embedded in the architecture of society, the cycles of culture, and the very potential of human cognition. And the Vatican, as custodian of these truths, continues the task of preserving, interpreting, and guarding a story far older, more intricate, and more consequential than conventional history allows. As scholars continued their painstaking study of the Vatican's hidden manuscripts, a startling pattern emerged. The Anunnaki had not merely influenced physical structures or societal hierarchies, they had shaped the very way humans perceive reality. The texts repeatedly emphasized that human cognition, memory, and imagination were subtly calibrated by these beings over millennia. The Anunnaki understood that knowledge alone is insufficient. Perception must also evolve to interpret, integrate, and act upon that knowledge responsibly. This insight, recorded in enigmatic cuneiform tablets and cryptic annotations, suggests a level of foresight so profound that it borders on incomprehensible. The development of human consciousness itself was being guided, tested, and refined by an intelligence that operates on temporal and spatial scales far beyond ordinary comprehension. The manuscripts reveal that education, ritual, and cultural storytelling were meticulously designed to expand human awareness incrementally. Stories passed down through generations, myths of gods, heroes, floods, and celestial journeys were more than allegories. They were lessons in pattern recognition, ethical reasoning, and the consequences of action. In each narrative, humans were presented with choices, moral dilemmas, and symbolic frameworks that reflected Anunnaki strategies for developing judgment and discernment. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence that the Anunnaki were orchestrating a multidimensional curriculum, one that combined morality, cognition, and observation with practical instruction in architecture, agriculture, and astronomy. Humanity was not simply learning facts. It was learning how to learn, how to see, and how to navigate an increasingly complex world. Equally striking is the Anunnaki's apparent use of encoded challenges. The manuscripts describe puzzles embedded in the landscape, in the alignment of monuments, in sacred geometries, and even in ritual practices. These challenges required observation, insight, and often collaboration to resolve. Success was rewarded with access to higher knowledge, deeper understanding, or technological innovation, while failure brought consequences ranging from societal disruption to natural calamities. Scholars in the Vatican interpret these as deliberate mechanisms for measuring human capability, resilience, and ethical judgment. In essence, civilizations were being trained, tested, and evaluated, their collective progress continuously monitored against a standard that was simultaneously practical and metaphysical. One example comes from the study of celestial alignments encoded in ancient architecture. Pyramids, ziggurats, and ceremonial sites often correspond to planetary or stellar positions, eclipses, and solstices. The text suggests that these alignments were not symbolic alone. They functioned as observatories and teaching instruments, enabling humans to track cosmic cycles, understand celestial mechanics, and integrate this knowledge into societal planning. Agriculture, governance, and ritual were all informed by these observations. The Anunnaki's influence extended beyond instruction into the shaping of practical human survival. ensuring that communities could thrive while simultaneously learning to recognize patterns that extend beyond the immediate, the terrestrial, and the obvious. The manuscripts also underscore the Anunnaki's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They describe experiments in leadership, social cohesion, and emotional regulation, noting how fear, awe, and curiosity can motivate or mislead. Certain rulers were guided through omens and symbols. Some populations were influenced by constructed narratives, rituals, or ceremonies. The texts reveal that humans were being tested not merely on intellect, but on character and ethical responsibility. Misinterpretation or abuse of knowledge was punished indirectly, through consequences embedded in societal, environmental, or cosmic systems. The Vatican scholars recognize that these lessons are timeless. Power without understanding, curiosity without caution, and innovation without ethical grounding invariably lead to collapse. Perhaps most unsettling is the Anunnaki's approach to knowledge itself. It was never given freely. It was earned through observation, insight, and ethical decision-making. The manuscripts emphasize that premature access to advanced understanding could be catastrophic, destabilizing society or provoking calamity. Knowledge was layered, encoded, and protected, requiring initiative, collaboration, and discernment to uncover. This strategy reflects a profound understanding of human potential and limitation. The Anunnaki did not simply provide solutions. They crafted processes for discovery, ensuring that humanity matured alongside its knowledge. The Vatican archives provide clear evidence that this deliberate method of transmission was applied consistently across time and geography, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Mesoamerica to the Indus Valley. The texts also suggest that human creativity was harnessed intentionally. Art, music, architecture, and storytelling were not merely aesthetic pursuits. They were tools for aligning perception, cultivating insight, and encoding understanding. Music, in particular, is described as a method of harmonizing human cognition with cosmic cycles, creating resonance that amplified comprehension and memory. Ritual, drama, and allegory functioned similarly, embedding lessons in emotionally compelling forms that ensured retention, application, and ethical reflection. Scholars in the Vatican note that this approach demonstrates a remarkable understanding of learning psychology and human development, applied not as abstract theory, but as a practical, empirically observed methodology spanning centuries. The manuscripts further highlight the Anunnaki's long-term vision. They anticipated not only the progression of human societies but also the development of technology, language, and scientific understanding. Instructions were encoded in ways that could be deciphered only after humans developed the necessary tools or conceptual frameworks. Celestial mechanics, mathematics, metallurgy, and writing systems were all scaffolded, ensuring a gradual but coherent evolution of knowledge. The Vatican's custodianship of these texts thus becomes part of this continuum. The Church functions as a guardian, interpreter, and mediator, ensuring that humans engage with these lessons responsibly and at an appropriate stage in their cognitive and cultural evolution. Among the most provocative elements of the manuscripts is the suggestion of ongoing observation. The Anunnaki, though physically absent, appear to have left mechanisms for monitoring human progress and alignment with encoded principles. Symbols, structures, and rituals act as instruments of continuity, ensuring that knowledge, ethical principles, and cosmic awareness persist across generations. Scholars note that certain architectural alignments and ritual practices may even interact with environmental and astronomical cycles, subtly reinforcing desired patterns of thought and behavior. Humanity, in effect, continues to navigate a carefully constructed landscape of influence, where observation, experimentation, and ethical testing remain embedded in the physical and cultural world. The psychological and spiritual implications for scholars are profound. Those who engage deeply with the manuscripts often experience disorientation, awe, and a sense of temporal expansiveness. It is as if the human mind is momentarily aligned with a scale of intelligence that transcends ordinary perception, revealing the interplay of knowledge, responsibility, and ethical choice across millennia. The Vatican enforces strict protocols for study, emphasizing ethical reflection, meditative practice, and communal dialogue to mitigate the destabilizing effects of these encounters. Scholars are aware that they are not merely interpreting history, they are interacting with a legacy that bridges consciousness, civilization, and cosmic design. The manuscripts also challenge conventional theology. If human development has been guided by beings with intelligence far beyond our own, questions of free will, divine providence, and moral responsibility become layered with complexity. The Vatican scholars reconcile this not by dismissing faith, but by integrating the Anunnaki framework as a complementary perspective. Humans operate within a continuum influenced by higher intelligence, yet still retain agency, responsibility, and moral consequence. Faith, knowledge, and ethical choice are interwoven, each informing and shaping the other. The text suggests that understanding the Anunnaki's guidance enhances, rather than diminishes, humanity's sense of purpose, responsibility, and potential. As the camera moves through the silent, dimly lit archives, the manuscripts seem to pulse with the weight of knowledge, observation, and responsibility. Each symbol, line of text, and architectural diagram carries centuries of accumulated strategy, foresight, and design. The Anunnaki's influence is not a relic of history. It is an active framework guiding cognition, ethics, and civilization itself. Humanity, the manuscripts imply, has always been more than it realizes. Observed, instructed, tested, and refined by a consciousness both alien and intimately intertwined with its own evolution. And the Vatican, as guardian, continues to mediate between revelation and comprehension, preserving a legacy so profound that it challenges the very essence of what it means to be human. The deeper the Vatican scholars delved into the manuscripts, the more unsettling and awe-inspiring the Anunnaki's influence appeared. These texts reveal not only the design of human civilization but also the careful orchestration of human belief and perception, suggesting that the Anunnaki had a profound understanding of the mind itself. The manuscripts repeatedly emphasize that knowledge, while necessary, is insufficient unless paired with comprehension and ethical insight. To this end, humans were guided incrementally, their curiosity harnessed and their mistakes observed, their achievements nurtured and their failures recorded as part of a grand continuum. The Anunnaki strategy was not coercive domination but deliberate cultivation, a careful calibration of intellect, morality, and creativity across millennia. One of the most fascinating aspects of the manuscripts is the Anunnaki's manipulation of human intuition. They understood that humans often perceive patterns before understanding them consciously, and that instinct can guide discovery when properly nurtured. Symbols, rituals, and architectural alignments were deliberately constructed to interact with perception, subtly encouraging observation, insight, and deduction. A ceremonial site might be aligned to a specific celestial body, a myth might encode numerical knowledge, and a ritual might impart principles of social cohesion. Through these methods, the Anunnaki were not merely teaching facts. They were training the human mind to recognize complexity, adapt to uncertainty, and integrate knowledge across multiple domains. The Vatican scholars recognize that this layered pedagogy is far more sophisticated than any traditional form of education or guidance. The manuscripts further illustrate the Anunnaki's fascination with human resilience and ethical judgment. Many passages describe tests designed to evaluate leadership, cooperation, and moral reasoning. Communities were challenged by environmental stress, social pressure, or scarce resources, and the Anunnaki observed how they responded. The consequences of success or failure were encoded in societal advancement, survival, or catastrophe. Human history, according to these records, becomes a tapestry of experiments, with civilizations rising and falling not randomly, but according to their alignment with principles carefully observed and subtly enforced. The Vatican scholars realize that what appears as historical happenstance, floods, wars, migrations, or revolutions, may instead be evidence of this ongoing evaluation, a measured assessment of humanity's capacity to wield knowledge responsibly. Equally significant is the Anunnaki's sophisticated approach to secrecy and revelation. Knowledge was never handed out wholesale. It was earned, tested, and layered. Some information was immediately practical, aiding survival or societal development. Other knowledge was encoded in symbols, rituals, or architecture, accessible only to those with the insight or tools to decipher it. Still deeper truths were reserved for those whose cognitive, ethical, and spiritual maturity could handle them without causing harm. This meticulous control suggests that the Anunnaki understood the dangers inherent in human curiosity. Knowledge without preparation, insight without discipline, or power without responsibility could be catastrophic. The Vatican, in turn, mirrors this principle, carefully regulating access to manuscripts, artifacts, and encoded wisdom, maintaining a balance between revelation and comprehension. The texts also indicate the Anunnaki's profound engagement with time. Their interventions were not limited to immediate events but extended across centuries and even millennia. Strategic placement of monuments, encoded texts, and ceremonial observances served as markers, guides, and lessons for future generations. The Vatican scholars have observed recurring patterns, where ancient instructions resonate with events centuries later, suggesting that the Anunnaki anticipated the evolution of human societies and knowledge. Time, in this context, is not linear but layered, a multidimensional framework in which cause and consequence intertwine, and in which observation and action create ripples that extend far beyond immediate perception. Humanity, therefore, is simultaneously actor, subject, and student in this vast temporal experiment. Perhaps most astonishing is the manuscript's evidence of the Anunnaki's understanding of ethics and governance. Leadership was tested not only for intelligence or ambition, but for fairness, restraint, and moral discernment. Kings and priests were carefully guided through omens, symbols, and encoded instructions, their decisions evaluated for alignment with broader principles of stability and growth. Ethical failure, misapplication of knowledge, or misuse of power was met with consequences, social, environmental, or systemic, that reinforced the Anunnaki's framework. Scholars note that this approach to moral testing extends across millennia and continents, creating a subtle but pervasive influence on the trajectory of human governance, law, and societal organization. Civilization itself becomes a reflection of cosmic ethics, guided by intelligence both unseen and intricately aligned with human development. The manuscripts also reveal a deliberate calibration of human creativity. Art, music, architecture, and literature were all treated as instruments for cultivating awareness, pattern recognition, and ethical reasoning. Music, in particular, is described as harmonizing human perception with cosmic cycles, aligning cognition with environmental and celestial rhythms. Art encoded abstract principles, and storytelling transmitted complex moral lessons across generations. These creative expressions were simultaneously aesthetic, pedagogical, and ethical tools, designed to cultivate comprehension, reflection, and social cohesion. The Vatican scholars note that this approach reflects an extraordinary understanding of the human mind, demonstrating foresight and precision that remain difficult for modern cognition to fully grasp. In parallel, the manuscripts describe the Anunnaki's engagement with natural systems. They controlled, observed, and adjusted rivers, harvest cycles, and urban planning in ways that balanced human needs with experimental design. Environmental interventions served multiple purposes: sustaining populations, measuring societal response, and reinforcing lessons embedded in encoded instructions or ritual practices. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence that the Anunnaki strategy was both pragmatic and educational, guiding civilizations in a manner that nurtured survival, cognition, and moral development simultaneously. Humanity, therefore, was being trained in both practical and philosophical domains, learning to understand the consequences of action in the physical, social, and cosmic spheres. Equally revealing is the manuscript's attention to the continuity of influence. Symbols, rituals, and encoded knowledge persisted across millennia, allowing humans to interact with Anunnaki guidance even in periods where direct observation had ceased. The text suggests that cultural memory, architecture, and ritual practice act as instruments of ongoing observation and instruction, ensuring that knowledge, moral principle, and cosmic awareness persist across generations. Scholars within the Vatican interpret this as a sophisticated strategy for sustaining influence while minimizing interference, allowing humanity to develop agency and insight while remaining aligned with the principles encoded in the Anunnaki framework. The psychological impact on those who study the manuscripts is profound. Extended engagement often produces disorientation, awe, and a sense of temporal expansion, as if the mind briefly aligns with a scale of intelligence that spans centuries and dimensions. Scholars report visions, intuitions, and flashes of insight that align with textual instructions, suggesting a resonance between human cognition and the encoded patterns left behind. The Vatican enforces strict protocols. Ethical reflection, communal discussion, and meditation are required to process these encounters responsibly. The manuscripts are thus not inert relics but active instruments, capable of shaping perception, insight, and understanding in the present, just as they shaped civilizations in the past. Finally, the texts emphasize the ongoing relevance of the Anunnaki's lessons. Knowledge, power, and ethical discernment are inseparable. The capacity to comprehend and act responsibly remains the measure of human potential. The Vatican's custodianship continues this mission, ensuring that the knowledge survives intact and is interpreted responsibly. Humanity, according to the manuscripts, is both subject and participant in a vast experiment. Observed, guided, and tested across time, space, and moral dimensions. Civilization, creativity, and consciousness are simultaneously human achievements and evidence of design, a reflection of both potential and responsibility, guided by an intelligence that continues to echo through history. As the dim light of the archives falls on the ancient manuscripts, the weight of these revelations presses upon scholars and observers alike. The Anunnaki's influence is everywhere, encoded in monuments, embedded in culture, and present in the very structure of human perception. Humanity's story, when viewed through these texts, becomes not merely a record of achievement or conflict, but a continuum of observation, instruction, and ethical testing orchestrated by an intelligence whose understanding of time, cognition, and morality surpasses our own. The Vatican, as guardian, interprets and preserves this continuum, ensuring that these truths endure, guiding humanity toward a comprehension of itself, the universe, and the profound responsibilities of knowledge and insight. The manuscripts suggest that the Anunnaki's influence extended not only to human knowledge and civilization but also to the intimate spheres of personal destiny. The texts describe meticulous observation of individuals from birth, recording tendencies, intellectual potential, and ethical disposition. Children, the records note, were often guided through subtle interventions, their environment shaped to enhance particular traits, to nurture resilience, creativity, or discernment. These interventions were neither arbitrary nor cruel. They were precise calibrations designed to awaken potential while testing character. The Vatican scholars, poring over these annotations, recognize that such observations are evidence of a civilization or an intelligence so advanced that it understood human development at levels modern science has only begun to theorize. In essence, every person may have been part of a vast experiment, their life a microcosm of the lessons encoded into society, culture, and consciousness. These observations, however, were never merely passive. The manuscripts describe deliberate shaping of opportunity, circumstance, and challenge. Some individuals were placed in positions where decisions could affect many lives, where ethical judgment would be tested, and where failure or success would echo through history. The Anunnaki appear to have understood the complex interplay between individual action and societal consequence, recognizing that the behavior of one person could catalyze change across generations. Leadership, moral insight, and creativity were not innate alone. They were cultivated, tested, and refined. Humanity, therefore, was simultaneously autonomous and guided, a species being taught how to balance freedom with responsibility in ways that continue to resonate across millennia. One of the most remarkable aspects of these records is the Anunnaki's anticipation of human curiosity. The manuscripts repeatedly emphasize that curiosity, if directed appropriately, is a vehicle for growth, understanding, and innovation. Conversely, unchecked curiosity without insight, preparation, or ethical consideration can lead to catastrophe. Accordingly, knowledge was often layered, presented incrementally, and encoded in ways that demanded interpretation. Symbols, rituals, and architectural alignments served as guides for the perceptive, offering clues to those capable of connecting patterns across time, space, and culture. The Vatican scholars recognized that this method created a system in which discovery was both a reward and a responsibility, teaching humans to respect the balance between insight, action, and consequence. The texts also explore the Anunnaki's interest in the dynamics of power and governance. Political, social, and religious leaders were not randomly placed. They were observed and sometimes subtly guided. Decisions were evaluated according to long-term effects on culture, societal stability, and the ethical alignment of their communities. Mistakes were instructive, sometimes catastrophic, reinforcing lessons about the proper use of authority and the interplay of personal ambition and communal welfare. This careful monitoring extended across generations, creating a framework in which leadership, morality, and societal function were interwoven with cosmic principles encoded through architecture, ritual, and story. Civilization, from this perspective, is a network of decisions, actions, and consequences orchestrated within the bounds of both freedom and oversight. The manuscripts further describe the Anunnaki's fascination with human emotion and motivation. Humans, it seems, are deeply influenced by fear, awe, curiosity, and desire. These emotional states were harnessed to guide behavior, reinforce learning, and shape ethical judgment. Ritual, music, and art were all instruments of emotional calibration, designed to focus attention, convey moral lessons, and synchronize human perception with broader cosmic patterns. The Vatican scholars have observed that this layering of instruction, emotional, ethical, and cognitive, is unlike any conventional educational system. It reflects a profound understanding of psychology applied over centuries, using culture, environment, and circumstance as both teacher and test. Another striking theme is the Anunnaki's manipulation of knowledge dissemination. While practical information, agriculture, construction, or astronomy, was accessible and applied, deeper truths were encoded, requiring synthesis, observation, and ethical insight. Failure to interpret correctly could have dire consequences, while success opened pathways to innovation, understanding, and influence. Knowledge, in this sense, was never neutral. It was both empowerment and trial. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence that the Anunnaki sought not only to guide human development but also to preserve it, ensuring that insight would emerge in alignment with maturity, responsibility, and moral comprehension. Humanity's progress, then, is both guided and earned, an interplay of external design and internal realization. The manuscripts also hint at the integration of environmental and cosmic awareness into human culture. The Anunnaki appear to have understood that humanity's survival and intellectual evolution were intertwined with the rhythms of the earth and stars. Agriculture, astronomy, architecture, and ritual were aligned with natural and celestial cycles, enabling humans to develop pattern recognition, forecasting ability, and ethical understanding. These alignments were not coincidental. They were deliberate tests, invitations to comprehend the interconnectedness of existence. The Vatican scholars emphasize that such instruction combines survival skills with cognitive expansion, reinforcing the notion that the Anunnaki's intervention was simultaneously practical, philosophical, and pedagogical. Equally fascinating is the encoding of ethical instruction in myths, legends, and ceremonial practices. Stories of gods, floods, heroes, and divine intervention were more than entertainment. They were lessons in moral reasoning, social cooperation, and consequence evaluation. These narratives, repeated across cultures, subtly instilled patterns of behavior and judgment, teaching humans to navigate complex ethical landscapes. The manuscripts suggest that success in interpreting these stories was intended to translate into real-world insight, cultivating leaders, thinkers, and innovators capable of understanding and influencing the trajectory of civilization responsibly. The Vatican's custodianship ensures that such knowledge remains accessible only to those prepared to interpret it carefully, maintaining a balance between revelation and comprehension. The Anunnaki's influence also extended to the calibration of creativity. Music, art, and architecture are repeatedly emphasized as conduits for cognitive and moral development. Music, in particular, is described as a method of attuning human perception to natural and cosmic patterns, reinforcing comprehension and emotional regulation. Architecture, through geometry, alignment, and proportion, encodes astronomical and ethical principles. Art and myth communicate complex lessons across generations, preserving continuity of knowledge while training the mind to perceive hidden patterns. The Vatican scholars recognize that this integration of creativity, morality, and cognition represents a pedagogical sophistication far beyond conventional human understanding, demonstrating deliberate orchestration of multiple dimensions of human potential. The manuscripts also reveal that the Anunnaki's interventions were iterative. They monitored the effects of guidance, evaluated results, and adjusted circumstances to reinforce lessons or correct misalignments. Catastrophe, reward, or opportunity were all part of a system designed to test resilience, judgment, and ethical comprehension. The Vatican scholars note that this system was flexible, allowing for human agency while still guiding outcomes within parameters that ensured both survival and intellectual development. The pattern is evident across time and geography. Civilizations that aligned with the encoded principles flourished, while those that deviated faced disruption, collapse, or enforced learning through consequence. Finally, the texts underscore the ongoing relevance of these lessons. Knowledge, ethics, and perception are inseparable. Understanding carries responsibility, and insight without comprehension is dangerous. Humanity continues to navigate the legacy of the Anunnaki, encountering symbols, patterns, and challenges embedded in the physical and cultural world. The Vatican's role is not merely historical preservation. It is the stewardship of a living continuum, guiding interpretation, safeguarding knowledge, and ensuring that humanity remains capable of integrating revelation with responsibility. Civilization, creativity, and consciousness are simultaneously human achievement and evidence of a deliberate, multigenerational design, a legacy whose depth and influence extend into the present and the future. The manuscripts hint at a dimension of the Anunnaki's design that is perhaps the most unsettling of all: the manipulation of destiny itself. While much of their influence is evident in architecture, culture, and knowledge, the texts suggest a subtler, almost imperceptible shaping of life paths, historical events, and the very flow of human experience. Individuals, families, and even entire civilizations appear to have been subtly guided toward outcomes that aligned with a larger cosmic framework. Decisions that seemed random or spontaneous may, in reality, have been the result of centuries of cumulative observation and subtle influence. Scholars within the Vatican realize that this raises profound questions. If human destiny is intertwined with this ancient intelligence, what is the nature of free will? And how much of history as we know it is the outcome of choices versus the careful orchestration of an unseen hand? Evidence for this influence comes from both the encoded texts and the physical remnants of civilization. Ancient cities, pyramids, and ceremonial sites often exhibit alignments, dimensions, and placements that are far too precise to be coincidental. In many cases, the same geometric ratios recur across continents, embedded in structures that are separated by thousands of miles and centuries of cultural divergence. The manuscripts suggest that these constructions served multiple purposes: as observatories, instructional tools, and markers of alignment between human activity and cosmic principles. The Vatican scholars note that the Anunnaki's genius was not only in providing information but in designing a persistent, interactive system capable of guiding human development subtly, without direct confrontation, yet with profound cumulative impact over time. The texts describe the strategic use of symbols and encoded narratives. Myths of gods, epic journeys, floods, and celestial battles were not mere allegory. They were intricate lessons in pattern recognition, morality, and cosmic cause and effect. Within each story, humans were presented with challenges requiring interpretation, foresight, and ethical reasoning. Success in understanding these narratives often translated into practical knowledge, social influence, or technological advancement. Conversely, misinterpretation could result in societal instability, resource mismanagement, or conflict. The Vatican scholars are particularly intrigued by the Anunnaki's ability to calibrate these lessons for universality. Despite cultural differences, the principles embedded within myths, rituals, and symbols are remarkably consistent, revealing a deliberate framework designed to cultivate comprehension across generations and geographies. Equally remarkable is the manuscript's attention to human psychology and social dynamics. The Anunnaki, it seems, anticipated human desires, fears, and tendencies, structuring interventions that leveraged these traits without overwhelming autonomy. Leaders were tested through circumstance, opportunity, and challenge, while ordinary people were exposed to encoded lessons through ritual, architecture, and art. Emotional responses were observed and subtly guided. Awe-inspired curiosity, fear enforced caution, and wonder encouraged exploration. The Vatican scholars note that this strategic calibration of emotion, cognition, and ethical engagement reflects an understanding of human development that is centuries beyond conventional modern science. Humans were not merely taught. They were cultivated, their minds trained to perceive, interpret, and act in alignment with complex, often unseen principles. The manuscripts suggest that the Anunnaki's influence extended into human biology and genetic inheritance. Certain families, lineages, and communities were observed over generations, with particular traits encouraged through environmental, social, or even ritual means. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence that human potential, intellectual, ethical, and creative, was being nurtured according to long-term objectives. While controversial, the texts imply that this guidance was neither oppressive nor coercive in a simplistic sense. It was subtle, deliberate, and calibrated to produce individuals capable of insight, moral judgment, and leadership. Civilization, in this view, is a tapestry woven not only of choices and achievements but also of latent potential nurtured across millennia, directed toward outcomes that aligned with a broader cosmic plan. Central to the manuscripts is the concept of contingency and resilience. While the Anunnaki guided humanity, they did not eliminate failure or uncertainty. Catastrophes, conflicts, and societal collapse were part of the observed curriculum, serving as corrective measures or lessons in adaptability. The texts describe civilizations that misapplied knowledge or acted unethically, suffering consequences that were proportionate and instructive. Success was rewarded, but it required insight, discipline, and ethical responsibility. The Vatican scholars note that this approach ensures the evolution of both knowledge and character. Humans learn to navigate complexity, anticipate outcomes, and integrate understanding, developing the ability to act responsibly within both immediate and long-term contexts. Another striking aspect is the interplay between science, mathematics, and mysticism in Anunnaki design. The manuscripts emphasize that understanding the cosmos, natural law, and human behavior are inseparable pursuits. Architectural alignments, sacred geometries, and encoded numeric patterns serve as practical instruction in astronomy, engineering, and mathematics while simultaneously imparting ethical and philosophical lessons. Scholars within the Vatican observe that this multidimensional pedagogy ensures that humans must integrate intellect, ethics, and creativity to grasp the broader framework. Knowledge is never isolated. It is a living, interconnected system designed to cultivate wisdom rather than mere technical proficiency. The texts also reveal that the Anunnaki anticipated the evolution of human consciousness itself. Humans were not expected to achieve insight instantaneously. Rather, comprehension would emerge gradually as societies matured and cognitive tools evolved. Knowledge was scaffolded. Simple truths were presented early, while more complex concepts required accumulation of experience, ethical development, and cultural sophistication. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence of extraordinary foresight. The Anunnaki were not merely influencing immediate outcomes, they were nurturing a species capable of transcending its limitations, cultivating the capacity to perceive, understand, and act in alignment with principles far beyond ordinary human experience. The manuscripts further highlight the Anunnaki's fascination with pattern recognition and symbolic literacy. Humans were taught to perceive connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena, natural cycles, social dynamics, and celestial events, and to extract principles that could be applied across contexts. This encoding of knowledge ensures both continuity and resilience. Even in the absence of direct instruction, humans who engage deeply with architecture, ritual, or myth can rediscover the principles embedded within. The Vatican scholars emphasize that this strategy preserves the integrity of instruction across time, culture, and circumstance, allowing the Anunnaki's influence to persist even as civilizations rise and fall. Finally, the manuscripts underscore a sobering truth. The Anunnaki's guidance carries responsibility. Knowledge is inseparable from ethical judgment, and insight without comprehension can be dangerous. The Vatican scholars recognize that this principle remains vital for modern humanity. Technological power, global interconnectedness, and scientific advancement all amplify the consequences of ethical failure. Civilization, creativity, and consciousness are both opportunities and trials, and the Anunnaki's legacy reminds us that wisdom emerges not merely from discovery but from integration, reflection, and responsible action. The manuscripts serve as both historical record and moral compass, preserving a continuum of influence, observation, and instruction that continues to shape humanity even today. As the dim light illuminates the ancient manuscripts in the vaulted Vatican archives, the gravity of the Anunnaki's design becomes palpable. Every line of text, symbol, and diagram is part of a deliberate, multigenerational framework intended to cultivate understanding, ethical insight, and resilience. Humanity's story, when viewed through this lens, is not random. It is a continuum of observation, testing, and guidance orchestrated by intelligence far beyond our ordinary perception. The Vatican's role is to preserve, interpret, and mediate this legacy, ensuring that the lessons embedded within the texts endure, informing the human mind, civilization, and consciousness in ways that remain both profound and mysterious. And as scholars linger over the manuscripts, one truth becomes clear. Every choice, every discovery, and every achievement is part of a continuum shaped by a cosmic intelligence whose influence reaches from the dawn of history to the present moment, subtly steering humanity toward understanding, responsibility, and perhaps transcendence. The manuscripts reveal that the Anunnaki's guidance was never static. It evolved alongside humanity, adapting to shifting civilizations, technological development, and cultural transformation. Far from being passive observers, they were active participants in the trajectory of human evolution, intervening subtly in moments that would determine the survival, growth, or decline of civilizations. The texts suggest that interventions were often invisible, embedded in the structure of cities, the timing of rituals, or the alignment of astronomical monuments. Every action was measured, calculated, and precise, designed to create a balance between freedom and influence, trial and instruction, knowledge and ethical responsibility. The Vatican scholars, studying these patterns, perceive an intelligence operating on scales of time, space, and consequence that challenge human comprehension. One of the most striking examples involves the strategic placement and design of ceremonial centers. Pyramids, ziggurats, and temples often exhibit alignment not only with celestial events but also with terrestrial markers, such as rivers, mountain ranges, and resource nodes. The manuscripts suggest these sites were constructed as observatories, instructional tools, and symbolic representations of cosmic principles. Within their geometry and orientation lay encoded lessons in mathematics, astronomy, and social order, as well as subtle ethical teachings. The Vatican scholars emphasize that these alignments are not coincidental. They reflect deliberate orchestration, revealing a layer of guidance embedded within the very fabric of civilization. Each monument, each sacred space, becomes a nexus of knowledge, observation, and instruction, silently guiding those who approach it with insight. The manuscripts also detail the Anunnaki's interest in societal cohesion. Leaders were often tested through circumstance, challenged to navigate complex social dynamics, and observed in their responses to ethical dilemmas. Communities, too, were evaluated for resilience, cooperation, and moral alignment. The texts describe instances in which failure to act wisely resulted in societal disruption, while success led to prosperity, technological advancement, and cultural flourishing. The Vatican scholars note that this pattern extends across time and geography, suggesting a deliberate method for cultivating human intelligence and morality simultaneously. Civilization, under this framework, is both a laboratory and a classroom, with ethical and cognitive development proceeding hand in hand, guided by unseen hands that measure, observe, and intervene. Another dimension of the manuscripts focuses on human creativity as a conduit for growth. Music, art, and storytelling were carefully calibrated to cultivate awareness, pattern recognition, and emotional intelligence. Music, in particular, is described as harmonizing the mind with cosmic and natural rhythms, training perception and reinforcing insight. Architecture, through proportion, alignment, and sacred geometry, embeds mathematical, astronomical, and ethical principles. Mythology and allegory encode moral and philosophical lessons, creating a subtle but pervasive framework for comprehension. The Vatican scholars recognize that these creative endeavors were not ornamental or incidental. They were integral to the Anunnaki strategy, shaping cognition, morality, and perception in ways that ensured both continuity and evolution. The manuscripts also hint at genetic and lineage-based observation. Certain families and communities were noted for their aptitude, resilience, or ethical discernment, and the Anunnaki appear to have subtly guided their development over generations. Environmental, social, and ritual conditions were calibrated to nurture specific traits, enhancing potential for leadership, creativity, and insight. Scholars within the Vatican interpret this as evidence of an intelligence profoundly attuned to human biology and development, capable of orchestrating progress while preserving free will. Humanity's evolution, then, is revealed as both a natural process and a guided trajectory, with potential cultivated over millennia through observation, subtle intervention, and education. Equally remarkable is the manuscript's encoding of contingency. Catastrophes, failures, and societal collapse are not treated as punitive measures but as part of a system of feedback and learning. Civilizations that misapplied knowledge or acted unethically were exposed to consequences proportional to their deviation, creating opportunities for reflection, adaptation, and recovery. Conversely, civilizations that aligned with encoded principles thrived, achieving cultural, technological, and ethical advancement. The Vatican scholars interpret this as evidence of a dynamic, iterative design, in which success and failure are both instructional, reinforcing patterns that cultivate resilience, insight, and responsibility. The manuscripts further explore the Anunnaki's use of symbols and encoded narratives to preserve knowledge across time and geography. Myths of gods, celestial events, floods, and epic journeys encode principles of ethics, observation, and cause and effect. These narratives, while culturally distinct, often share recurring patterns, suggesting a deliberate universality in instruction. Success in decoding these patterns results in practical understanding, leadership, or technological advancement, while misinterpretation carries consequences. The Vatican scholars note that this system ensures continuity of guidance, even when direct instruction is absent, and that the encoded principles remain accessible to those who approach them with insight, patience, and ethical consideration. Another striking feature is the manuscript's exploration of perception itself. Humans are described as capable of perceiving patterns, aligning with cosmic rhythms, and comprehending complex interconnections, but only if trained to do so. Observation, interpretation, and ethical reasoning are inseparable. Understanding the world requires both intellectual rigor and moral discernment. The Anunnaki appear to have cultivated perception incrementally, embedding lessons in architecture, ritual, storytelling, and environment, ensuring that comprehension emerges at the proper pace. The Vatican scholars emphasize that this approach is a sophisticated pedagogy, integrating multiple dimensions of human experience, practical, ethical, and metaphysical, into a coherent system of instruction. The manuscripts also address the interplay of time and consequence. The Anunnaki's interventions are rarely immediate. Effects unfold across generations, and guidance often requires interpretation and synthesis over decades or centuries. This approach reflects a sophisticated understanding of causality and human development, in which short-term events are linked to long-term outcomes. The Vatican scholars recognize that this temporal design ensures resilience, continuity, and ethical calibration, reinforcing the idea that civilization itself is both a product of observation and a vehicle for instruction. Humanity is, in essence, simultaneously the observer, the participant, and the recipient of a vast experiment spanning millennia. Equally profound is the emphasis on ethical responsibility. Knowledge, power, and creativity are inseparable from moral discernment. Insight without responsibility is depicted as dangerous, potentially catastrophic. The manuscripts repeatedly stress that humans must integrate understanding with ethical action, balancing ambition with caution, curiosity with foresight, and freedom with responsibility. The Vatican scholars interpret this as a guiding principle that transcends time, applicable not only to ancient civilizations but to modern humanity as well. The encoded lessons continue to resonate, offering insight into the challenges posed by advanced technology, global interconnection, and the ethical dilemmas of contemporary society. Finally, the manuscripts suggest that the Anunnaki's influence is ongoing, persisting in subtle forms even in the present day. Symbols, rituals, and architectural alignments continue to shape perception, ethical judgment, and societal development. The Vatican's custodianship of these texts ensures that the lessons endure, interpreted responsibly and preserved for future generations. Humanity's story, when viewed through this lens, is not random but part of a continuum, an intricate weave of observation, guidance, challenge, and ethical cultivation, orchestrated by an intelligence both ancient and extraordinarily perceptive. Scholars in the dimly lit archives of the Vatican recognize that civilization, creativity, and consciousness are simultaneously human achievement and evidence of deliberate design, a legacy whose depth and influence extend from the dawn of recorded history to the present day, and whose implications remain as profound as they are mysterious. The manuscripts reveal that human civilizations were subtly guided by the Anunnaki through social structures, rituals, and knowledge systems designed to cultivate moral and cognitive growth. Leadership, creativity, and insight were tested through circumstances both ordinary and extraordinary, creating opportunities for growth, reflection, and resilience. Failures were instructive, shaping collective understanding, while successes reinforced ethical awareness and societal stability. Symbols, myths, and stories were not merely cultural ornamentation but encoded lessons for interpreting human behavior, predicting consequences, and fostering ethical discernment. The Vatican scholars note that this guidance balances autonomy with direction. Humans retain free will, yet their choices ripple across time, impacting generations. Knowledge, when integrated with ethical judgment, becomes a tool for progress. Without it, civilizations risk collapse. Every city, monument, and ritual aligns with this continuum, revealing patterns of influence that span centuries. Observation, perception, and ethical reflection are inseparable in this system, and humanity's role is both participant and beneficiary, navigating a complex tapestry of insight, consequence, and moral evolution. The Anunnaki's influence extends into culture, creativity, and education. Architecture, music, storytelling, and ritual are carefully crafted to teach insight, pattern recognition, and ethical discernment. Humans are trained not only to understand knowledge intellectually but to internalize it emotionally and morally. Communities, families, and leaders were observed across generations, with subtle guidance shaping potential without removing agency. Civilization itself becomes a living classroom, where every action, triumph, or failure contributes to cumulative learning. The manuscripts show that resilience, adaptability, and ethical judgment were as important as technical knowledge. Leaders were measured not merely by power but by their ability to integrate wisdom, foresight, and moral responsibility. The Vatican scholars see that this is a system of iterative growth, where humans are both students and stewards, responsible for interpreting guidance, applying insight, and preserving lessons for future generations. Humanity's journey is framed as a continuous dialogue between choice, consequence, and understanding, revealing the subtle yet pervasive hand of a higher intelligence shaping civilization over millennia. The manuscripts detail the Anunnaki's orchestration of civilization across time and space, emphasizing the interplay of freedom, guidance, and ethical responsibility. Every cultural pattern, ritual, and symbolic system was designed to teach humans perception, foresight, and moral discernment. Humans were challenged through circumstance, community, and leadership, refining insight and ethical awareness. Knowledge and creativity were inseparable from responsibility. Civilization's successes and failures were part of a continuum of learning, testing, and adaptation. The Vatican scholars note that the Anunnaki's influence was not coercive but invitational. Humans retained agency, yet guidance was woven into every layer of experience. Observation, pattern recognition, and ethical judgment were cultivated across generations, creating resilience and continuity. civilization becomes a living, evolving laboratory, where culture, ritual, and architecture encode lessons that survive even through upheaval. Every choice, every action, and every insight contributes to this ongoing tapestry, a system that integrates perception, morality, and creativity. The manuscripts conclude that humanity is both participant and custodian of this continuum, tasked with understanding, preserving, and acting responsibly within the legacy carefully orchestrated over millennia. The manuscripts reveal the staggering truth. Humanity's story is entwined with a legacy far older and more deliberate than history admits. The Anunnaki were not mere observers. They orchestrated a system where civilization, creativity, and morality are threads in a tapestry unfolding across millennia. Every choice, discovery, and act of insight carries consequence, echoing through generations. Monuments, rituals, and encoded symbols are instruments of perception, guiding understanding and ethical reflection while leaving freedom intact. Knowledge without responsibility is perilous. Creativity without conscience is incomplete. The Vatican scholars realized that human perception itself was nurtured, honed through music, architecture, and storytelling, blending cognition, emotion, and morality. Civilizations rise and fall not by accident, but as part of an ongoing continuum, where failures teach and successes cultivate wisdom. Each generation inherits lessons layered in myth, ritual, and structure, and must navigate the delicate balance of autonomy and guidance. The manuscripts emphasize that humanity is both student and steward, shaping the trajectory of civilization while being shaped in return. The revelation is awe-inspiring yet humbling. Insight demands ethical courage, creativity requires reflection, and every act resonates within a design that spans time itself. The Anunnaki's influence is revealed as a living continuum, threading through the past, present, and future. Humanity is both canvas and brush, participating in a creation unfolding over millennia. Rituals, architecture, music, and storytelling were designed to align perception with cosmic principles, cultivating insight, moral discernment, and resilience. The Vatican scholars understand that this system balances freedom with subtle guidance, nurturing wisdom without coercion. Knowledge carries ethical weight. Ambition, innovation, and creativity must be tempered with reflection and foresight. Failures and challenges are essential for growth, offering lessons in adaptation, cooperation, and ethical judgment. Patterns repeat across generations, teaching humans to recognize connections, anticipate consequences, and integrate perception with action. Creativity, observation, and morality are inseparable. Insight emerges only when all three converge. Civilization itself is revealed as a living, adaptive system, shaped by the interplay of guidance, consequence, and human agency. Every discovery, ethical choice, and creative act is a thread in an ongoing tapestry of knowledge, morality, and responsibility. The manuscripts close with an invitation to recognize patterns, integrate lessons, and act with consciousness and ethical awareness. Humanity's role is both powerful and precarious, tasked with honoring the legacy of the Anunnaki while actively shaping the future. The final revelation is the Anunnaki's influence on human consciousness itself. Their design operates not only in history but in thought, perception, and morality, creating a living continuum where every decision shapes civilization's trajectory. Humans are active participants, with free will yet guided by subtle instruction embedded in myths, rituals, and symbols. Knowledge, creativity, and insight are gifts entwined with responsibility. Misuse can be catastrophic, yet proper application fosters growth, resilience, and ethical evolution. The manuscripts emphasize perception as a cultivated faculty, trained to recognize patterns, interpret meaning, and act with moral discernment. Civilizations and individuals are continuously tested through circumstance, challenge, and reflection. Creativity, through art, architecture, music, and storytelling, is a conduit for understanding, embedding wisdom across generations. The Vatican scholars grasp the weight of this legacy. Humanity's choices resonate beyond the immediate, influencing future generations and shaping the continuum of knowledge, morality, and perception. The manuscripts close with a call to action, to perceive deeply, act responsibly, and engage consciously with the unfolding tapestry of civilization. The Anunnaki's legacy persists, subtle yet profound, challenging each generation to rise to the ethical, cognitive, and creative potential encoded into human existence. Understanding this continuum is not merely academic. It is a moral imperative, a responsibility, and an invitation to participate fully in the evolution of consciousness.